Chapter 4258. Yu Jing looked calm, but as soon as he finished speaking, a powerful aura exploded from his body and shook the surrounding space. Nie Tian and Rui Qinyu were both shocked and immediately retreated. Yu Jing looked old, but when his aura exploded, it was extremely terrifying. It was almost as powerful as the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master. The Heaven Dao Pavilion Master stood in midair and frowned. He shook his head and said, "Brother Yu Jing, why do you have to do this?" He looked at Yu Jing with disdain. To him, this battle was completely unnecessary. Yu Jing was merely putting up a last-ditch struggle. "Yin Yiqian, you're too confident." Yu Jing smirked and rose into the air. Thousands of vines appeared behind him and kept growing like dancing snakes. Yin Yiqian was the name of the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master. However, ever since he became the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master, no one had called him by this name for a long time. Yin Yiqian was not offended by Yu Jing calling him by his name. Instead, he felt a sense of familiarity. He smiled and said, "Brother Yu Jing, you haven't changed at all. You haven't changed either. You're still so talkative." Yu Jing sneered and struck out with his palm. Immediately, the 10,000 vines went berserk and pressed toward Yin Yiqian. Countless thorns appeared in midair and came at him. Nie Tian was shocked when he felt the power contained in the vines. Yu Jing was definitely more powerful than the 5 Deans. If he was an ordinary sky martial saint ancestor, he would have been killed by the vines. "Brother Yu Jing, it's been hundreds of thousands of years since we last met. You've improved a lot. Unfortunately, you can't hurt me." Yin Yiqian's arrogant voice was heard in the sky. Then, a terrifying bolt of purple lightning appeared and exploded like a pillar in the sky. It split open and formed a huge purple lightning net that enveloped Yu Jing. Boom, boom, boom. In the next moment, wherever the purple thunder net passed, the vines were torn apart and directly collapsed in the void. Yu Jing's eyes darkened. He quickly retreated a few hundred meters before he managed to stabilize himself. He looked terrible. He did not expect Yin Yiqian to be so powerful. The two of them had not seen each other for hundreds of thousands of years. During this long period of time, Yu Jing had improved, and so had Yin Yiqian. The reason why those peak martial arts experts were stronger than martial artists of the same level was mainly because they could maintain a steady increase in their strength. However, the vast majority of martial artists, especially those with a lifespan of more than 1,000,000 years, began to decline in strength. Yu Jing and Yin Yiqian were both warriors with powerful bloodlines. Even though they were millions of years old, they could still maintain their strength and even improve. "Brother Yu Jing, we are old friends. There's no need to make such a big fuss." Yin Yiqian shouted, "I believe that Brother Yu Jing is a smart man. Why do you have to do something that is impossible?" "What a joke." Yu Jing growled. "Yin Yiqian, do you really think you are invincible?" The more arrogant Yin Yiqian was, the more he hated him. "Of course, I'm not the strongest in the heavens, but I'm more than capable of defeating you." Yin Yiqian smiled faintly, showing off his superior attitude. Although he was courteous to Yu Jing on the surface, in his eyes, Yu Jing was just a defeated opponent and was not worthy to be his enemy. "Is that so?" Yu Jing sneered again. 10,000 vines reappeared behind him, violently forming a giant hand. It was as large as a mountain and pressed down on Yin Yiqian. Yin Yiqian, however, was not afraid at all. A bolt of purple lightning appeared behind him and split the giant hand, forcing Yu Jing to retreat again. Yu Jing steadied himself, but there was blood at the corner of his mouth and his face was pale. It was only then that he truly felt the difference in strength between him and Yin Yiqian. "Brother Yu Jing, it's been hundreds of thousands of years. You're getting worse and worse," Yin Yiqian said in a low voice with a smirk. Victory was in his grasp. Yu Jing's wrinkled face turned green and red, looking very ugly. However, he did not give up. Instead, the energy in his body exploded again. The vines spread madly, forming a sea of trees in the air. "I'm tired of this battle. Let's call it a day." Yin Yiqian smiled faintly. Purple lightning surged in his palm and condensed into 10,000 bolts of lightning, forming a terrifying thunder beast. Its roar shook the sky and pierced through the clouds. Oh no, Nietian frowned, thinking that this was bad. Actually, Yu Jing's strength was not much weaker than Yunitian's. It was just that their strengths countered each other. Yu Jing was a wood elemental martial artist, while Yunitian was a thunder elemental martial artist. The latter was the natural enemy of the former. Elder, you can't hold on much longer, Rui Qinyu said in a low voice. She could tell that something was wrong as well. Nietian glanced at Rui Qinyu and could not help but regret asking Yu Jing to take her away just now. However, Yunitian was too fast. Even if Rui Qinyu left with Yu Jing, they would probably be stopped halfway. The problem now was, once Yu Jing was defeated, who else would be able to protect Rui Qinyu? Yun Etian's strength was beyond imagination. In Nietian's impression, only super powerhouses like the Yang Godsword Emperor or Hayakuten could stop him. Other than a powerhouse like the Yang Godsword Emperor, there might be another person who could stop Yun Etian, Zhu Rushuang. Unfortunately, Zhu Rushuang had yet to recover from the previous battle. Even if she had recovered, she would not be able to appear here immediately. Let's end this. At that moment, Yunitian moved. With a palm strike, the purple thunder beast pounced at Yu Jing. Yu Jing frowned. His eyes trembled as he made a decision in an instant. The forest behind him surged and thorny tentacles extended, attempting to stop the thunder beast. However, the thunder beast was unusually fierce. Wherever it passed, the thorny tentacles were crushed. In the blink of an eye, it had arrived before Yu Jing. Good timing. Yu Jing sneered at the thunder beast. Blood chi surged from his body and turned into a fountain of blood, dyeing the forest red. Bang! Then, before the thunder beast could even react, the blood-colored vines enveloped the thunder beast, layer by layer, and killed it. The sudden change made Yun Etian's expression change. You're willing to sacrifice your life for the 10 annihilations of the evil woman. How could he not see that Yu Jing had burned his blood chi and the absolute martial intent in his body to create such a terrifying blood-colored vine? Yun Etian, I may not be able to defeat you, but I can trap you. At that moment, Yu Jing's voice was heard. An endless sea of vines appeared, enveloping Yun Etian like an ocean. Damn it! Yun Etian reacted immediately, but it was too late. He roared in anger. This was the imprisonment array that Yu Jing had created at the cost of his life. It did not threaten his life, but it could trap him for a long time. Chapter 42:59. Senior Yu. Nietian's heart was pounding as Yu Jing's last words echoed in his ears. He did not expect Yu Jing to sacrifice his life to hold the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master back by burning his true will to protect Rui Qinyu. Elder Yu. Rui Qinyu did not expect Yu Jing to be so determined to protect her. She frowned and was moved. In the sky, the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master was trapped by Yu Jing's blood-colored vines and could not escape. Ryu, let's go. Nietian knew that they did not have much time. With the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master's strength, the blood-colored vines would not be able to trap him for long. Therefore, they had to leave as soon as possible. Otherwise, they would be letting Yu Jing down. Rui Qinyu looked at the blood-colored vines that were slowly disintegrating. She finally nodded and left with Nietian. The two of them were extremely fast. After leaving Bloodwing City, they headed east towards the nearest net of the Holy World. They had to hurry because the net of the Holy World was also controlled by the Heaven Dao Sacred Pavilion. It would probably be closed soon. After running for about 3 hours, the two of them arrived at the nearest network of the net of the Holy World. Wait a minute. Rui Qinyu wanted to go there directly, but was stopped by Nietian. What's wrong? Rui Qinyu frowned and asked anxiously. Nietian looked from afar and observed carefully. The people in the net of the Holy World were queuing up slowly. Everything seemed normal, but he felt that something was amiss. Let's take a look first, Nietian said after thinking for a while. Okay. Rui Qinyu nodded and tried to hide her aura to prevent being discovered. She did not know how the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master found her. Therefore, she could only hide her aura as much as possible. Let's go. After watching for a while, Nietian did not notice anything unusual and said softly, Rui nodded, and the two of them prepared to enter the net of the holy world. Nietian. However, right at this moment, a strange voice suddenly rang out, causing Nietian's body to stop abruptly. He was quite shocked. He heard very clearly that this voice belonged to none other than Qing Chi. "Follow me." Qing Chi's voice rang out again, but his figure did not appear. Nietian nodded and immediately caught a breath. He pulled Rui Qinyu and followed it. Following this aura, the two of them quickly entered a mountain range and arrived at a remote valley. "Senior." Nietian sensed that Qing Chi was in the valley and called out. Then, a stream of light appeared, and Qing Chi's figure landed. He looked a little nervous, but he quickly came to Nietian and Rui Qinyu's side. After making sure that both of them were fine, he was a little relieved. "Senior, why are you here?" Nietian felt a sense of familiarity when he saw Qing Chi. He felt much more at ease and asked happily, "I already know what happened in Bloodwing City. I guessed that you would come here, so I waited for you in advance," Qing Chi said, sighing as he looked at Nietian. Nietian nodded slightly. It seemed that Qing Chi had just returned to Bloodwing City and used some other method to quickly arrive here to wait for them. "Senior, Rain and I are in danger right now. We need to find a safe place." Nietian took a deep breath and calmed himself down. Since the Heavenly Tao Sacred Pavilion has their eyes on you, they will definitely not let you off so easily. Qing Chi frowned and said, "But the Heavenly Tao Sacred Pavilion's influence is spread across the heavens. To find a safe place is as difficult as ascending to the heavens. You saw that just now. The net of the sacred world has already been sealed. Those people are just waiting for you to catch them." This, Nietian's eyes trembled, and he couldn't help but gasp. He had vaguely sensed that something was wrong, but he didn't expect it to be so dangerous. The Heavenly Tao Sacred Pavilion's reaction was much faster than he had expected. "I have some teleportation scrolls, but I can't teleport you to another world." Qing Chi sighed and asked, "Nietian, do you have any place to take refuge in?" Nietian thought for a while and nodded. "I have two places in mind. One is the ancestral dragon's abyss of the dragon race, and the other is the ancestral land of the four ancient sacred clans. Since the Heavenly Tao Sacred Pavilion had their eyes on them, there was basically no place for them to stay in the all-heavens sacred world. The ancestral dragon's abyss was more secluded, and with Zhu Rushuang guarding it, it was barely a safe place. The ancestral land of the ancient sacred clan should be safe as well. After all, Nietian was the high priest of the four ancient sacred clans. However, he wasn't sure if the Firmament Emperor had broken free from the Heaven's Tablet. If the Firmament Emperor had already been reborn, going to the ancestral land of the ancient sacred clan would be akin to walking into a trap. Furthermore, he didn't know how to contact the ancient sacred clans. "I heard that something big happened to the dragon race recently, and the ancestral dragon's abyss might not be safe either. As for the ancestral land of the four ancient sacred clans, it won't be easy to enter it." Qing Chi frowned, as if he was thinking about something. "Senior, do you know about Amorous Affair?" At this moment, Nietian suddenly thought of something and asked with a trembling gaze. "Romance." Qing Chi frowned, and his expression turned ugly. How could Nietian still be thinking about Amorous Affair at a time like this? In his opinion, Nietian wasn't someone who would indulge in pleasure. "Senior, Amorous Affair should be a person or an organization." Seeing Qing Chi's reaction, Nietian knew that Qing Chi had misunderstood, so he quickly explained. Yu Jing had mentioned Amorous Affair before his death, asking Nietian to bring Rui Qinyu to look for Amorous Affair. At that time, Nietian was shocked by Yu Jing's death, so he didn't pay much attention to it. Now that he thought about it, he naturally had to clarify things. Then, he didn't hide anything and directly told Qing Chi about the Human Emperor's palace. After listening to Nietian, Qing Chi's eyes were filled with anger and hatred other than shock. After a while, he said in a cold tone, "Back then, when Lord Dongwang died mysteriously, I suspected that there was a bigger force behind the Heaven Tao Sacred Pavilion. All these years, I've investigated a lot in secret. All along, I thought that the human emperor's palace was just a legend. I didn't expect it to really exist. Senior Donghuang's death should be the doing of the human emperor's palace, Nie Tian said solemnly. Qingqi nodded and calmed down. He tried hard to recall, but he couldn't recall anything related to amorous affair. Since Yu Jing was willing to die to protect Rui Qinyu, his words naturally couldn't be doubted. He asked Nie Tian to bring Rui Qinyu to look for amorous affair, which meant that it was a force that could go against the human emperor's palace, or a person or force that could escape the pursuit of the human emperor's palace. However, even with Qin Chi's vast knowledge, he had no idea what amorous affair was. If even Senior doesn't know what amorous affair is, then it's going to be troublesome, Nie Tian sighed when he saw Qin Chi's troubled expression. Perhaps there's someone who knows, Qin Chi said solemnly. Chapter 4260. Nie Tian's gaze changed when he heard Qin Chi mention the all-ghost ancestor. His surprise was mixed with some joy. He was obviously no stranger to the all-ghost ancestor. Most of his understanding of Donghuang Zhengrong came from the former. He had even fought against the former in a hidden dragon competition not long ago. The all-ghost ancestor had once been sealed by Donghuang Zhengrong. He broke out of the seal due to a chance encounter, but he was reborn as a primordial ghost fetus. He had no choice but to possess a ghost called the Left Head. As a result, the all-ghost ancestor had never defeated Donghuang Zhengrong in his life, so he feared and hated the latter. After meeting Nie Tian, he naturally transferred his fear and hatred to the latter. He even wanted to compete with the latter again. That was why Nie Tian was so surprised when Qin Chi mentioned the all-ghost ancestor. You know about the all-ghost ancestor? Qin Chi could not help but frown when he saw Nie Tian's reaction. He never thought that Nie Tian would know so many people at such a young age. Nie Tian smiled faintly and told him about how he knew the all-ghost ancestor. Qin Chi was dumbfounded when he heard that. He only reacted after a long while. He had heard that the all-ghost ancestor had returned to the all-heaven sacred world, but he never thought that it was Nie Tian who had released him. Senior, does the all-ghost ancestor really know about amorous affair? Nie Tian looked at Qin Chi and asked with some uncertainty. Qin Chi returned to his senses and sighed. Since amorous affair could resist the human emperor's hall, it must be someone from a very long time ago. No one knows how long the all-ghost ancestor has lived in this world. If there's someone who knows about amorous affair, it can only be him. Yes, Nie Tian nodded. It seemed that Qin Chi was also uncertain and was only guessing. He then asked, Senior, where do we find the all-ghost ancestor then? The saint's net of the entire all-heaven sacred world was probably sealed now. Even if it wasn't sealed, it would still thoroughly investigate Nie Tian and the others. It would be almost impossible for them to leave. If we can't take the open path, we can only take the secret path, Qin Chi said after a moment of silence. Secret path. Nie Tian was stunned, but before he could ask more, Qin Chi had already stood up. He and Rui Qinyu quickly followed. After leaving the mountain range, Qin Chi and Nie Tian, Rui Qinyu, and Qi began a long journey. 7 days later, the three of them came to a deep river in the extreme north of the everlasting sacred world. Looking down at the river, Nie Tian couldn't help but ask, Senior, what is this place? For the past 7 days, they had been hurrying on their way. Qin Chi hadn't said anything along the way, which made him very curious about what the secret path was. The ghost crossing the Blood River. Qin Chi's eyes darkened as he slowly descended to the air less than 100 meters above the river. Tian. He felt even more curious. Qi when Qi Tian, Chen Ghost. Ghost Tian was. Ghost. However, the river below was very strange. It was as deep as an abyss, and the water was very dark. Even with Nie Tian's eyesight, he could only see up to 5 or 6 meters below the water surface. What was even more strange was that there seemed to be something swimming under the river. It was dark red and seemed to be a snake. To be precise, it's a tributary of the ghost. Qin Chi didn't care about Nie Tian's expression. He nodded and explained, Rumor has it that the ghost is the origin of the ghost race. It's called the Mother River by the Ghost Race. A very long time ago, before the all-heaven sacred world had split and was still a single entity, the ghost-crossing blood river meandered above the all-heaven sacred world and circled around it. After the all-heaven sacred world split, the tributaries of the ghost-crossing blood river spread across the all-heaven sacred world. The ghost-crossing blood river is very mysterious. Its water contains some kind of power. Even if the tributaries and the main stream are split, they can still sense each other. Therefore, every tributary of the ghost-crossing blood river has a mysterious ghost-crossing bridge. As long as you step on the ghost-crossing bridge, you can directly enter the mainstream. Nietian immediately understood and couldn't help but ask, "Isn't the ghost-crossing bridge similar to the net of saints?" "Yes." Qi nodded. "We need to enter the ghost-crossing blood river and find the ghost-crossing bridge. Then, we can enter the mainstream and directly reach the southern sacred world. The ghost race's experts live in the southern sacred world." Nietian's eyes lit up as he nodded vigorously. "All right, Nietian, you must follow me when we enter the ghost-crossing blood river." Qi, on the other hand, became nervous and said, "The ghost-crossing blood river is not an ordinary river. It contains a terrifying ghost power. Very few people can withstand it outside of the ghost race. This ghost power is very oppressive." "Yes," Nietian nodded. He glanced at Rui Qianyu, but the latter did not care. Then, the three of them entered the ghost-crossing blood river without hesitation. The moment he entered the blood river, Nietian sensed a terrifying, monstrous force assaulting him from all directions. It was as if a giant, invisible hand was trying to crush him to pieces. However, his martial body was strong. He could withstand the ghost power's oppression with a slight shake of his body. Rui Qinyu was also relaxed with a calm expression. On the other hand, Qingqi's old face was slightly red. He seemed to be struggling. Nietian immediately understood that this ghostly energy had an extremely strong perception ability. Martial artists of different cultivation bases would also feel different pressure from the ghostly energy. He and Rui Qinyu had lower cultivation levels, so the oppression was naturally lower. Qingqi's cultivation level was higher, so the oppression was higher. Qingqi saw that Nietian and Rui Qinyu were fine and immediately understood. He couldn't help but feel embarrassed. Just now, he was worried about Nietian and Qingqi, but now it seemed that he should be worried about himself. The three of them slowly sank into the blood river. Because of the ghost power, their vision was very narrow. They could only see tens of meters ahead. This blood river was very vast. The three of them searched underwater for a long time without finding anything. The longer they stayed in the blood river, the stronger the ghost power oppression on their martial bodies. Nietian and Rui Qinyu were fine, but Qingqi's face was tense. It was obvious that he couldn't hold on much longer. "Senior, are you okay?" Nietian saw that Qingqi couldn't hold on anymore and asked. "I'm fine." Qingqi held on and nodded. Nietian frowned. He didn't look good. With their speed of searching, who knows how long it would take to find the ghost crossing bridge. On one hand, the ghost crossing blood river was too big and their vision was too narrow. It was very difficult to search. On the other hand, they had no understanding of the ghost crossing bridge. Even if they found it by luck, they might miss it. "Senior, we can't keep searching like this. Let's go back to the surface." Nietian saw that Qingqi couldn't hold on anymore and said, Chapter 42:61. Be careful. Faced with the sudden attack, Nietian was the first to react. He shouted and rushed to the front. The energy in his body surged, and he forcefully opened a barrier that enveloped the three of them. Boom! The ghost waves crashed into them, and after a series of roars, they gradually dissipated. What a strong force! Qingqi felt the pressure around him weaken and couldn't help but exclaim. He felt like he had just survived a disaster. It was indeed very dangerous just now. If it wasn't for Nietian stepping forward in time, even if he didn't die, he would have been seriously injured. Under the pressure of the ghost crossing blood river, he couldn't release his energy, so he was not as strong as Nietian in the face of such an attack. "Nietian, are you okay?" Rui Qinyu exclaimed, and stepped forward to support Nye Tian. Qingqi frowned and saw that Nye Tian's face was pale and there was blood at the corner of his mouth. Obviously, he was seriously injured. Nye Tian took a deep breath and his complexion turned slightly better. He said solemnly, "I'm fine. The force just now was extraordinary. We must leave this place as soon as possible." Qingqi nodded and without hesitation, he dashed towards the water surface. Unfortunately, it was too late. Boom! A terrifying ghost wave appeared and pressed down from above their heads, swallowing everything in its path. Oh no! Qingqi felt the tyrannical pressure on his face, and he couldn't help but be startled. His face became stiff as he thought that something was wrong. In his current state, if he were to face this ghost wave head-on, he would most likely die a horrible death. At the critical moment, a figure appeared. Undercurrents surged around him, and he forcefully withstood the ghost wave's attack. Miss Rui Qinyu. Qingqi originally thought it was Nye Tian, but when he saw that it was Rui Qinyu, he couldn't help but exclaim, "I'm fine." Rui Qinyu steadied herself and didn't turn around. She only replied in a low voice. However, Qingqi could sense that Rui Qinyu was severely injured. The ghost wave, just now, was even more terrifying than before. Even if Nye Tian were to resist it, he would definitely be seriously injured. Rui Qinyu's martial body was not as strong as Nye Tian's, so her injuries would definitely be more serious. Charge out! Nye Tian sensed the urgency of the situation. He let out a low roar and rushed to the front like a flying fish, rushing straight into the water. Rui Qinyu and Qingqi followed closely behind, feeling much less oppressive. The three of them were extremely fast. In the blink of an eye, they had already traveled several thousand meters and were about to reach the surface of the water. But at this moment, Nye Tian felt that something was wrong. It was as if the pressure from above was getting stronger and stronger, making it difficult for him to move an inch. Why did the pressure suddenly increase? Qingqi also noticed this and could not help but ask. Nye Tian didn't answer. He just kept rushing forward. But at this moment, a scream was heard. Nye Tian's heart tightened. He immediately turned around and saw that Qingqi's figure had disappeared. He suddenly turned around and saw Qingqi's figure on the other side. He was falling continuously, as if he was being pulled by a terrifying suction force, like an invisible hand pulling him underwater. Nye Tian. Immediately afterwards, Raindrop Thousand Leaves let out a cry of alarm, and her body sank straight into the ground. Nye Tian reacted quickly. He reached out to grab Rui Qinyu's hand, but his body trembled and sank down as well. At this moment, Nye Tian felt the terrifying power firsthand. He was shocked. It was as if they had been sucked into a terrible whirlpool and were falling into the center of the whirlpool. To make matters worse, the deeper they went, the stronger the pressure of the ghost power around Nye Tian became. At this speed, they would soon be crushed to death by the ghost power in the water. Nye Tian forcefully steadied himself. He circulated the power in his body and struck out with his palm, trying to break out of the whirlpool. But before his palm energy could spread out, it was directly submerged. "Damn it," he growled. He felt his whole body tense up. "Nye Tian, don't worry about me. Go by yourself." Rui Qinyu forcefully broke free from Nye Tian's hand and quickly sank. "Ruoyu," Nye Tian shouted anxiously. Then he did something shocking. He turned around and directly rushed down. "Nye Tian." Rui Qinyu was shocked by Nye Tian's action and could not help but scream. Nye Tian's speed was extremely fast. Very quickly, he passed Rui Qinyu and Qingqi. His lips curled into a vicious smile, and he muttered, "I want to see what exactly is causing this." Since he could not get rid of the whirlpool, he might as well rush straight into the center. The strange thing was, as he rushed, he found that the pressure of the ghost power around him had weakened. "Senior, Ruoyu, follow me." This discovery made Nye Tian extremely happy, and he immediately shouted. Rui Qinyu frowned slightly. Without hesitation, she directly rushed over. "Let's do it." Qingqi hesitated for a moment. Then, he made up his mind and rushed down as well. To him, Nietion's actions earlier were simply crazy. But at this moment, he had no choice but to follow in his crazy footsteps. Then he found that the pressure around him was weakening. He could not help but be overjoyed, and his wrinkled face bloomed with joy. Nietion purposely slowed down. Very soon, the three of them were close together. Nietion, what is going on? Qingqi was so excited that he could not contain himself and asked excitedly. I don't know either. Nietion shook his head and smiled. He was completely stumbling upon this by accident. This seems to be a giant whirlpool. Where does it lead to? Qingqi calmed down a little and mumbled. Suddenly, he thought of something and exclaimed, Could it be that this whirlpool is the ghost crossing bridge? Nietion also thought of this and exclaimed. The energy released by the whirlpool carried with it the scent of time and space. At this moment, it was as if they were in a tunnel of time and space. There's someone up ahead. Just then, Rui Qianyu's eyes quivered and she exclaimed, Nietion's expression changed. Activating his demonic eye, he saw an indistinct black shadow below them. It was very strange. Why would there be people in a place like this? Qingqi was shocked, and he asked in astonishment. Nietion, on the other hand, frowned. Why did he feel that the black shadow was somewhat familiar? He suppressed his curiosity and increased his speed, because he felt that the suction force below them was weakening at an alarming rate. If they were really in a tunnel of time and space, then the suction force was weakening. It could mean that the tunnel was closing. In the blink of an eye, the three of them had sunk for thousands of meters. They were only tens of meters away from the black shadow below them. Nietion's pupils shrank involuntarily as he took a closer look at the figure. Nietion. Right at this moment, the black figure abruptly turned around. His eyes were like sharp blades in the dark night, flickering with a cold light as he spoke in a ghastly voice. His face was exposed in front of Nietion's group of three, and it was surprisingly similar to Nietion's. Chapter 4262. When Nietion shouted Devil's Knight's name, his pupils suddenly shrank, and his heart jumped to his throat. Never in his wildest dreams would he have imagined that he would meet the Devil's Knight here. Devil's Knight. Hearing this name, Qingqi's expression suddenly changed, and he was extremely surprised. It seemed that Nietion had mentioned to him that this person was the darkness that was born from the Star Origin Stone. Just like Hayakuten, the previous ninth astral emissary, Devil's Knight, was the devil in Nietion's heart. Hayakuten's power was very similar to Dongwang Zhengrong's, but it was darker. That was why it was called Defying Star Power. It could be said to be a kind of mutated power of the stars. What was even more terrifying was that the power of defying the stars was stronger than the power of the stars, and it could allow a martial artist to grow faster. Qingqi once said that Dongwang Zhengrong and Hayakuten had fought 3 times. Even though Dongwang Zhengrong won all 3 battles, the first one was easy, the second one was normal, and the third one was extremely difficult. This shows the rate at which Hayakuten is growing, far surpassed Dongwang Zhengrong. Even Dongwang Zhengrong himself had said that if there was a 4th battle, he would definitely not be Hayakuten's opponent. Good and evil, accompanied by light and darkness. However, it seemed that evil was suppressing righteousness, and darkness was overshadowed by light. The reason why the star-defying power was stronger than the star power was because of the mutation. However, the aura of Hayakuten's star-defying power was similar to that of the star power, which meant that the mutation was not that big. As for Devil's Knight, there was almost no aura of the power of the stars. This didn't mean that he didn't inherit the power of the stars, but it meant that the power of the stars had undergone a subversive change in his body. The reason for this subversive change was most likely due to the fiend god nascent embryo in Nietion's body, a power that could contend against the power of the stars. Therefore, the star-defying power in Devil's Knight's body was stronger, darker, and more terrifying than Hayakuten's. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the future Devil's Knight would be far more powerful than Hayakuten. Nietion knew that from the moment Devil's Knight was born, his fate was inextricably linked, and the two of them would inevitably be entangled. However, Meeting the Devil's Knight at this moment was completely unexpected. Nyetian, you're really haunting me. Devil's Knight's eyes were cold and gloomy as he spoke eerily. At this time, his appearance had changed a little, and there was a considerable difference between him and Nyetian. This undoubtedly meant that his independent consciousness had become stronger. In this world, there was probably no one who was willing to be someone else's clone, even if he was really a clone. Devil's Knight, why are you here? Nyetian's figure flickered, almost coming face to face with the other party as he asked in a deep voice. The Ghost Crossing Bridge is about to close. I advise you to put away these boring questions. Devil's Knight sneered, and then his figure moved, rushing towards a dazzling white ball of light below. It really is the Ghost Crossing Bridge. Nyetian's eyes trembled violently. He called for Qing Chi and Rui Qinyu to follow, and the three of them followed Devil's Knight. Nyetian, it seems that the Ghost Crossing Bridge was opened by this guy. Qing Chi felt that the pressure around them had weakened a lot, and he secretly transmitted his voice to Nyetian. Yes. Nyetian nodded slightly. He could also see that they had borrowed Devil's Knight's luck. However, he did not understand why Devil's Knight would come here, and why he would open the Ghost Crossing Bridge. Just as he was thinking, the three of them had already entered the white ball of light, and in the blink of an eye, they passed through it. However, Nyetian keenly sensed that the atmosphere around them had completely changed. It seemed that they had arrived at the main stream of the Ghost Crossing Blood River. One has to admit that it was thanks to Devil's Knight that they were able to arrive here without a hitch. Nyetian, I really did not expect to see you here. Devil's Knight looked at Nyetian and grinned. An eerie atmosphere surged around his body. Nyetian felt the atmosphere, and his face slowly changed. Though the atmosphere was evil, Nyetian could see the shadow of the astral force within it. In an instant, he understood that this was Devil's Knight's awakened against the stars. In the next moment, Nyetian suddenly sensed something and asked in surprise, You were just cultivating at the Ghost Crossing Blood River? He sensed that Mo Ye's star-defying power was somewhat similar to the Ghost Crossing Blood River's ghost power. It seemed that Devil's Knight was cultivating at the Ghost Crossing Blood River, absorbing the ghost chi from the Blood River. You're not that stupid after all. Devil's Knight laughed. I want to know, why did you come to the Ghost Crossing Blood River? Do I need to tell you? Nyetian raised an eyebrow and responded coldly. Devil's Knight smiled. Ordinary people enter the Ghost Crossing Blood River because they want to cross the Ghost Crossing Bridge. Looking at you guys in such a sorry state, if I'm not wrong, you guys are trying to avoid being hunted. So what? Eyebrows furrowed. He suddenly realized that Mo Yi was much calmer than before. He didn't seem as violent as before, but rather more cunning. Humph, Devil's Knight's lips twitched. What a coincidence. You're also looking for the ghost ancestor. You're also looking for the ghost ancestor? Nyetian couldn't help but frown and exclaim. The two of them were both looking for the ghost ancestor. What a coincidence. This is the main stream of the Ghost Crossing Blood River. Above, it is the 1,000 layers of ghost domain. Ordinary people wouldn't risk coming here unless they're here for the ghost race. Devil's Knight smiled wickedly. Nyetian, maybe we can cooperate. Cooperate? Nyetian froze for a second, then expressed his interest. How? We're both looking for the ghost ancestor, but as far as I know, he's in seclusion right now and won't easily meet people. Plus, if we want to meet him, we need to find the legendary ghost city first. This is not an easy task. Devil's Knight faintly smiled. Nyetian faintly smiled. Nyetian frowned. He didn't think too much about it. In fact, it made sense. The ghost ancestor was the sovereign of the ghost race. Naturally, not everyone could meet him. It was easy for the ghost ancestor to meet Nyetian, but it wasn't so easy for him to do the opposite. We accept the cooperation. At this time, before Nyetian could speak, Qing Chi stepped forward. Nyetian glanced at Qing Chi and slightly nodded. Even if the latter didn't say anything, he would still accept Devil's Knight's proposal. He didn't know why Devil's Knight wanted to find the ghost ancestor, but since the latter could open the Ghost Crossing Bridge, it meant that he had made a lot of preparations. Moreover, Cooperating with Devil's Night made Niet Tian feel an inexplicable sense of excitement. Very well. Follow me. Devil's Night faintly smiled. Then his silhouette flickered like a ray of black light, rushing towards the surface of the water. Niet Tian's group of 3 immediately followed. They were all injured. Staying underwater would be detrimental to their injuries. In the blink of an eye, the 4 of them arrived at the surface of the water. Niet Tian steadied himself and looked around. The scene in front of him moved him. Chapter 4263. Niet Tian stared at the white bones floating on the river and couldn't help but be stunned, unable to react for a long time. With so many white bones, it was likely that there were millions of people who died. These people were those who attempted to enter the Thousand Layers ghost domain. Unfortunately, most of them died on the way. Even if there were some lucky ones who entered the domain, they were killed by the ghost race, and their corpses were thrown into this ghost-crossing blood river. Devil's Night, on the other hand, was not surprised at all. He faintly said, "Thousand Layers ghost domain." This was the second time that Niet Tian heard this name from Devil's Night's mouth. He couldn't help but frown and was very curious about what this place was. "It's right above your head." Devil's Night smiled and raised his eyebrows. Niet Tian's eyes trembled. He looked up at the sky and saw layers upon layers of black clouds rolling, as if there were terrifying, fierce beasts lurking within. The sky was actually covered by such thick black clouds. No wonder the surroundings were dusky. Even daytime was like night. Rumor has it that the Thousand Layers ghost domain is the ghost race's top secret place. Outsiders are not allowed to enter. Even the ghost race's people need to have a certain level of strength to enter the domain. Qingqi looked at the thick black clouds above his head and sighed. It seems that the rumor is true. Umph. Devil's Night smiled strangely and said, "The Thousand Layers ghost domain hides the ghost race's deepest secret. Of course, outsiders are not allowed to enter." Ghost race's secret? Qingqi heard Devil's Night's words and couldn't help but frown. He asked in astonishment, "What secret?" Devil's Night looked at him and smiled without saying anything. Niet Tian, on the other hand, furrowed his brows. He guessed that the reason Mo Yi appeared here was most likely because of the secret of the Ghost Clan. He was very curious about what kind of secret would make Devil's Night so interested. "Let's go. Let's see what the legendary thousand-layered ghost domain is hiding." At this moment, Devil's Night smiled faintly. His silhouette flickered, and like a shooting star, he shot towards the sky, directly rushing towards the 1,000 layers of evil spirits. Seeing this, Niet Tian took a deep breath and told Qingqi and Rui Qinyu behind him, "Follow me closely." All 3 of them were injured, especially Rui Qinyu, who suffered the most serious injury. Although Qingqi's cultivation was the strongest among them, the pressure from the ghost energy in the ghost-crossing blood river was too great, causing his Yuan meridians to be severely damaged. It would take several days for him to recover. Niet Tian spread his wings and carried Qingqi and Rui Qinyu, following closely behind Devil's Night. Soon, the 4 of them arrived at the foot of the 1,000 Layers ghost horde. At this moment, Niet Tian finally saw the truth behind the layers of black clouds. This was not a black cloud at all, but something similar to black sand. Upon a closer look, there were grains of black sand floating in the air, gathering together endlessly like dark clouds. Niet Tian carefully observed the flow of the black sand. At this moment, Fat Cat's voice suddenly sounded, reminding Niet Tian. Niet Tian's eyes trembled, and he immediately opened his devil's eye. At the same time, he connected with the demon fox of Eternal Night's divine sense and expanded his mental strength to the extreme, carefully perceiving the black sand. After a while, bean-sized beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. Devil's Night was very calm and did not enter directly. Instead, he looked at Niet Tian, obviously waiting. About a quarter of an hour later, Niet Tian finally recovered, but his eyes trembled slightly, appearing extremely shocked. "Niet Tian, what did you find?" Devil's Night frowned and asked in a low voice. "Senior, I didn't see wrong, did I?" Niet Tian, however, ignored him. Instead, he turned around and looked at Qingqi. even though he was trying his best to remain calm. His voice was clearly trembling. Qing Chi's face was solemn, and he naturally knew what Nie Tian was talking about. He nodded slowly and said, "This 1,000 layers of ghosts is indeed a big formation." Nie Tian's eyes trembled violently, and the shock in his heart was perfectly written on his face. Just now, when he sensed the flow of the black sand, he could faintly see that the flow of the black sand had extremely regular changes, and the black sand sometimes gathered and sometimes dispersed, which was clearly the formation runes. However, he still did not believe it, or rather, he was hoping to get lucky, so he went to ask Qing Chi, and the latter gave him a positive answer. Who would have thought that the vast and endless 1,000 layers of ghosts was actually a big formation? Qing Chi's expression was also shocked, and he could not help but exclaim, "Such a huge formation is really a work of heaven and earth. You're saying that the 1,000 layers of ghosts is a big formation?" At this moment, Devil's Knight frowned and could not help but ask. Yes. Nie Tian calmed down slightly and nodded. He could not help but look at the white bones on the river of blood below. No wonder so many people had died in the 1,000 layers of ghosts. Anyone who could make it to the 1,000 layers of ghosts had some talent and strength, but they could not pass through the 1,000 layers of ghosts. In the end, they could only become sacrifices in the 1,000 layers of ghosts. No wonder that guy warned me to be careful of the 1,000 layers of ghosts. Devil's Knight's eyes trembled slightly as he murmured, "Then how can we pass through the 1,000 layers of ghosts?" Rui Qinyu frowned and could not help but ask. Nie Tian's eyes darkened slightly, and he looked at Qing Chi. Qing Chi was not very powerful. He could not even be regarded as first-rate in the All-Heaven Saints world, but his mastery over formations was definitely second to none. It would not be an exaggeration to say that he was the greatest. If Nie Tian and Fat Cat work together, they should be able to find a way to pass through the 1,000 layers of ghosts as well, but they would definitely pale in comparison to Qing Chi. Qing Chi took a deep breath and said, "The 1,000-layered ghost vortex is a huge formation, and it hides an endless amount of killing intent. However, it's exactly because the formation is so huge that it's not too difficult to pass through it." With that, he directly stepped in and disappeared into the 1,000 layers of ghosts. Nie Tian and the others were stunned at first, but they soon returned to their senses and followed him in. The moment he stepped into the 1,000 layers of ghosts, Nie Tian could not help but change in expression. He could sense that the surrounding space was different from the outside world, as if it had been compressed. He felt like it was constricting when he was in there. "Follow me closely. Don't stray." Qing Chi's voice rang out. There was a hint of excitement in his calm voice. He was a formation master, so he felt an inexplicable excitement to be in such a huge formation. Nie Tian had Devil's Knight walk behind Qing Chi. Then Rui Qinyu followed closely behind him. He was the last. The three of them followed behind Qing Chi. They took every step carefully, not daring to be careless at all. Qing Chi sensed the aura of the formation as he planned the path in his head, so he did not move very quickly. Very soon, 3 days passed. The four of them had walked through the first 100 layers of the formation. This place was known as the 1,000 layers of ghosts. Even if there were not 1,000 layers, there were at least several hundred layers. As a result, they would need at least half a month to leave the formation at their current speed if there were no accidents. Chapter 4264. Watch out! Within the 1,000 layers of ghosts, Nie Tian instantly felt an oppressive aura pressing down on him. His expression immediately changed, and he cried out in alarm. Mo was following behind Qing Chi. His eyes flickered, and a black sword appeared in his hand. He slashed it down, forcibly breaking through the ghost face's illusory image. Seeing this, Nie Tian couldn't help but frown and go blank for a moment. He did not dare to believe that the seemingly majestic ghost face could not even withstand a single blow. Or maybe Devil's Knight was very strong? Nie Tian knew that Mo's current strength wasn't weaker than his, but it couldn't be much stronger, either. It seems that someone is giving us a warning. Devil's Knight smiled and said calmly, "A warning? Qing-Chi frowned and immediately understood. It's not an attack from the formation. It's from the person inside the formation. Yes. Mo-Yi nodded with a touch of indifference on the corner of his mouth. Before I came here, I heard that there are many gatekeepers in the thousand-layered ghost domain. So the warning just now must have come from one of them. Then why didn't he just kill us? Qing-Chi frowned and asked confusedly. Just now, the Qi was so strong that even a cultivator of the sky martial realm would be scared. It meant that the hidden gatekeeper was very strong. But strangely, he only warned them and didn't kill them. They are gatekeepers, not people who kill innocent people. Devil's Knight smiled and said, maybe he thinks that we are qualified to enter the 1,000 layers of ghosts. Qing-Chi's face darkened. He didn't think much of it. He felt that there must be something else. Devil's Knight seemed to know a lot. He just didn't want to talk about it. Then, the group calmed down and continued to move forward. In the blink of an eye, 3 days had passed. Nietian counted silently. They had passed the first 254 layers of the 1,000 layers of ghosts. It seemed that the deeper they went into the 1,000-layer ghost domain, the weaker the power of the formation became. For the next few days, everything was calm. Nietian and the others also sped up a lot. About 7 days later, they arrived at the last 100 layers of the 1,000 layers ghost web. However, the fact that things are going so smoothly made Nietian feel a little worried. This formation only looks huge. Once you enter it, the threat is actually not as great as an ordinary killing formation. Qing-Chi was very happy and laughed. I'm afraid not. The corners of Devil's Knight's mouth twitched strangely as he said, the real killing intent of the 1,000 layers ghost horde hasn't arrived yet. If we start to be complacent now, then there's only one thing waiting for us, death. Qing-Chi's expression stiffened. He then looked at Devil's Knight and said with a smile, I think you are a little too nervous. Without waiting for Devil's Knight to speak, Nietian took a step forward and said, Senior, I also don't think things are that simple. We still can't relax, and it's always better to be cautious. Qing-Chi's expression changed slightly, and he couldn't help but look a little ugly. He was a person who was cautious and prudent. Why did he suddenly become a little impetuous and not as stable as the two young people? Thinking of this, Qing-Chi couldn't help but blush and nodded heavily. In the last 100 layers of Ghost Horde, Nietian and the others walked more cautiously. Soon, they were only left with 10 layers of Ghost Horde, but Nietian keenly felt that the aura in the surrounding space began to change. In the void, a strange aura that was extremely difficult to detect circulated, making Nietian faintly feel a trace of difficulty in breathing. Nietian, something doesn't seem right. Rui Qinyu seemed to have also noticed something and said quietly. Nietian nodded and subconsciously turned to look at Mo-Yi. However, the latter remained calm and composed and didn't show any reaction. This state of Devil's Knight made Nietian feel very abnormal, because with the former strength, he should have already noticed that something was wrong. Nietian, he seems to be absorbing power from the surrounding space. Rui Qinyu secretly transmitted a message to Nietian, reminding him. Huh? Nietian's eyes sank slightly, and he immediately opened the Devil's Eye. Everything in front of him suddenly changed. The runes of the array were clearly visible, constantly surging, releasing a mysterious power. He focused his attention on Devil's Knight, and sure enough, he found that the latter's body was surging with a layer of faint halo, which was constantly absorbing power from the array. This discovery made Nietian's heart sink, and he immediately became nervous. Previously, Devil's Knight absorbed power from the ghost-crossing Blood River, and now he was absorbing power from the 1,000 layers of Ghost Horde. This was really too strange. This made him reconsider the purpose of Devil's Knight in the 1,000 layers of Ghost Horde. Be careful. At this moment, Qing-Chi suddenly screamed, very panicked. Nietian immediately reacted and suddenly raised his head. A black ghost face appeared, like a fierce beast pouncing on him. The next moment, without waiting for Devil's Knight to make a move, Nietian moved. His figure jumped directly, and the sky sword appeared in his hand. The sword intent around his body surged, and he slashed out wildly, blasting the ghost face. Bang! In the next moment, the two forces collided, and a muffled bang rang out. And yet Tian felt a violent impact, and his whole body was directly sent flying. Tian. Rui Qinyu reacted quickly and shouted. Her figure moved, and she caught Tian. Tian barely stabilized his body, a trace of blood hanging from the corner of his mouth, and his face was as pale as paper. Obviously, his injury was not light. Tian, are you okay? Qing Chi was shocked and hurriedly came to Tian's side and asked nervously. Tian wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and shook his head slightly, but his pair of eyes stared at Devil's Knight coldly. Seeing Tian's expression, Qing Chi immediately understood what was going on and couldn't utter a single word. They had encountered the same attack before, but Devil's Knight easily took it with ease. However, Tian had sustained serious injuries. The gap between the two of them was obvious. Qing Chi was very clear about Devil's Knight's identity, so he was very puzzled. Was Devil's Knight really so much stronger than Tian? If the current Tian was not Devil's Knight's opponent, then the gap between the two would only get bigger and bigger in the future. If you can't take it, why are you trying to be brave? Devil's Knight looked at Tian and did not panic at all, but smiled coldly. Devil's Knight, what the hell are you doing? How can you absorb the power of the 1,000 layers of evil spirits? Tian's face was cold, and he no longer concealed it, and asked directly. He knew that Devil's Knight was very strong, but he did not believe that the gap between him and Devil's Knight could be so big. Oh, I can see that. Devil's Knight's mouth twitched into a smile and looked at Tian with undisguised contempt and said, If that's the case, then I might as well tell you my new identity. Chapter 4265. Young Master of the Ghost Tribe. Tian's pupil shrank when he heard this title. Could it be that Devil's Knight was already a member of the Ghost Tribe? That's impossible. At this time, Qing Chi reacted and exclaimed, You're not a member of the Ghost Tribe. How could you be the young master of the Ghost Tribe? Humph. Devil's Knight couldn't help but laugh and asked, Who said that the young master of the Ghost Tribe must be a member of the Ghost Tribe? Qing Chi was stunned and couldn't speak for a while. The 1,000 Layers Ghost Domain was the most secret place of the Ghost Tribe. The strongest branches of the Ghost Tribe were all entrenched here, so the Ghost Tribe almost represented the Ghost Tribe, and the young master of the Ghost Tribe had a very high status in the Ghost Tribe. Generally, the Ghost Tribe was the next lord of all ghosts. So when Devil's Knight said he was the young master of the Ghost Tribe, Qing Chi was so shocked. This almost meant that Devil's Knight was the next lord of the Ghost Tribe. But Qing Chi was very clear about Devil's Knight's origin. He was not a member of the Ghost Tribe, so how could he be the lord of the Ghost Tribe? So you've been a member of the Ghost Tribe for a long time. Tian calmed down a little and said in a deep voice. At this moment, he understood many things. No wonder Devil's Knight could open the Ghost Crossing Bridge, absorb power from the Ghost Crossing Blood River, and absorb power from the 1,000 Layers Ghost Domain. Moreover, he could easily break the attack of the Great Formation. All of this was related to his identity as the young master of the Ghost Tribe. It seemed that Devil's Knight should have come to the Ghost Tribe a long time ago. It must not have been easy for him to become the young master of the Ghost Tribe. Yes. Devil's Knight looked at Tian with a mocking expression and said, Do you think I lied to you? Actually, no. And I think you should be grateful to me. Without me, you wouldn't have been able to come here. Tian was silent for a moment and said, You didn't bring us here just to tell us that you're the young master of the Ghost Tribe. He knew that Devil's Knight was extremely cunning and ruthless. He would never do something meaningless. First, tell me, why do you want the demon ghost? Devil's Knight said indifferently. After a moment of pondering, Tian said, So we're here for the all-ghosts ancestor, the old man. Devil's Knight laughed. He then glanced at Rui Qinyu and said, Let me guess. Did you awaken your bloodline and alerted the human emperor's palace behind the heavenly Tao sacred pavilion? They wanted to kill you, but you did it to protect yourself. That's why I'm looking for the old man. Nietion's heart tightened when he heard Devil's Knight's words. He didn't expect Devil's Knight to know so much. With Devil's Knight's abilities, it wasn't strange for him to sense that Rui Qianyu's bloodline was abnormal. But how did he know about the Human Emperor's Palace? Even Nietion only learned about the existence of the Human Emperor's Palace from Yu Jing not long ago. The Human Emperor's Palace. Devil's Knight seemed to know what Nietion was thinking. He smiled and said, "This organization has existed since the birth of the All-Heaven Sacred World. It's impressive that they still control the entire All-Heaven Sacred World after such a long time." "How do you know about the Human Emperor's Palace?" Nietion asked cold. He could no longer hold back his doubts. "Why? You can know about it, but I can't?" Devil's Knight's expression changed. He said coldly, "Is it because I'm just a copy of you in your eyes? That's why I can only live in your shadow, forever? Do I have to struggle at death's door before you?" Nietion frowned and fell silent. When Devil's Knight first appeared, he wanted to kill Nietion and replace him. Nietion also wanted to kill Devil's Knight. But in the end, the two of them escaped from death and went their separate ways. Recently, especially with Hayakuten's appearance, Nietion's opinion of Devil's Knight changed slightly. He felt that while Devil's Knight was a demon in his heart and his dark side, it wasn't completely undesirable. Just like Dong Wang Jingro. Since he spared Hayakuten's life, it meant that no matter how serious he was, Hayakuten still had value. The ultimate martial evil heaven had taken away Nietion's ninefold chaos beast, but at the same time, it had also pulled the Emperor's karmic ruin, Li Yuan, and the others into the primordial starry sky. Otherwise, the all-heaven sacred world would have been doomed. So no matter what Hayakuten was thinking, it was undeniable that he had saved the all-heaven sacred world. Moreover, what Nietion saw in Hayakuten was not pure evil. Since Devil's Knight had appeared, there was a reason for his existence. If Nietion really killed the current Devil's Knight, there was no guarantee that a second Devil's Knight would not appear. And Devil's Knight's attitude towards Nietion seemed to be born with hatred. So he wanted to kill the latter and replace him. Perhaps he just didn't want to live under another person's shadow. Or perhaps he wanted to become a complete person. At that moment, Nietion seemed to understand Devil's Knight's feelings. If you don't say anything, that means you agree. Seeing that Nietion didn't say anything, the killing intent in Mo Ye's eyes grew even stronger. "You must think that I shouldn't exist, and that my existence has been a mistake from the beginning to the end, don't you?" Mo Ye looked at Nietion and said, "I've never denied your existence, and I've never considered you my subordinate." Nietion suddenly looked up. His eyes flickered with a strange light. "You have your own independent consciousness. You have your own thoughts. You have your own vengeance and hatred. That's why you're a complete person. It's just that you're obsessed, thinking that only by killing me can you be a complete person. Isn't that so?" Devil's Knight's eyes flashed fiercely. "I was born because of you, so you must die because of me. Since you're the light and I'm the darkness, only one of us can live." Nietion frowned. After a long silence, he suddenly laughed and said, "Since you insist on killing me, how about we make a bet?" "Bet? What bet?" The corner of Devil's Knight's mouth twitched, his face cold and contemptuous. Nietion and the others were already in his bag. He could kill Nietion at any time. "I'll fight you 3 times. Nietion's eyes shone. "You and I will fight 3 times. If you can win once, I'll let you do whatever you want of me. Is that so?" Devil's Knight sneered. "You haven't killed me yet because you don't want to rely on other forces. You just want to kill me with your own hands." Nietion smiled faintly. "This is the obsession in your heart. You can't let it go. If you accept the 3 fights, you and I will fight fairly 3 times. If you win once, you can kill me with your own hands. If you lose all 3 times, I won't kill you. I just want you to give up on killing me and treat me as a stranger." "Umph." Devil's Knight looked at Nietion and couldn't help but sneer. "Nietion, you're overconfident." Chapter 4266. As soon as Devil's Knight's voice fell, a majestic aura burst out from his body. The explosive aura filled the surrounding void, giving people a heavy feeling of oppression. Qingqi felt the pressure on his face, and his face changed in horror. He exclaimed, "Absolutely not." Nie Tian's proposal of 3 battles was beyond his expectation, and Devil's Knight actually wanted to start the first battle immediately, which surprised him even more. It seemed that Nie Tian had chosen the method that Dongwang Zhengrong used to face Hayakuten, but Devil's Knight was a more terrifying opponent than Hayakuten. Judging from the strength that Devil's Knight had shown so far, it was obvious that he was stronger than Nie Tian. If it was under normal circumstances, Nie Tian might have some chance of winning. But at this moment, they were in 1,000 layers of Ghost Domain, and Devil's Knight could be said to have the geographical advantage. Nie Tian had no chance at all. Nie Tian's face was gloomy, and he didn't speak for a long time. He didn't expect that Devil's Knight would actually start the first battle. The reason why he proposed 3 battles on one hand was because he was influenced by Dongwang Zhengrong, and on the other hand, it was because he had no other choice. Devil's Knight's killing intent was firm. With his identity as the young emperor of Ghost Domain, Nie Tian and the others were already in his bag. The agreement of 3 battles was actually a chance to survive. As long as Nie Tian could win the first battle with Devil's Knight's temperament, he definitely wouldn't kill him, but would win in the next 2 battles. However, this first battle, his chance of winning was really not big. Seeing that Nie Tian didn't speak for a long time, Devil's Knight's mouth twitched coldly, and he smiled contemptuously. Nie Tian, you don't dare? Without waiting for Nie Tian to speak, Rui Qinyu suddenly stepped forward and said in a deep voice, "He is injured. I will replace him in the first battle." Nie Tian frowned. He could not help but look at Rui Qinyu. The latter's gaze was firm, revealing a cold, murderous intent. Replace? Devil's Knight could not help but chuckle. He glanced at Rui Qinyu coldly and said, "This is a battle between the 2 of us. You're not fit to interfere." "You." Rui Qinyu's face darkened and her fists cracked. Devil's Knight ignored her. Instead, he looked at Nie Tian and sneered. "Nie Tian, you can't really let a woman stand up for you, right?" Nie Tian smiled faintly and said, "This is a battle between you and me, so of course I won't let anyone else take my place. If you want to fight, I'll be happy to oblige, but I don't mind fighting with you. But let's make this clear. If I win, you can't kill us, and you have to take me to a meeting. Someone." "Sure." Devil's Knight did not question further and agreed immediately. He then smiled darkly and said, "If I win, not only will you die, but the 2 of them will die as well." "Then let's begin." Nie Tian smiled and said calmly. He knew that if he lost, Devil's Knight would not let Qingqi and Rui Qinyu leave. Therefore, he must win this battle. "Come on." Devil's Knight smiled coldly and then waved his hand. Suddenly, the runes in the air dissipated and formed a hollow, enclosed space. Like a barrier, it enveloped him and Nie Tian. This! Qingqi was forced back by a powerful force. When she stabilized herself, she could not see Nie Tian and Devil's Knight. All she could see was a huge barrier. "Where is Nie Tian?" Rui Qinyu's eyes trembled and she screamed. Qingqi calmed down and said helplessly, "They're inside this barrier. We can only wait." Obviously, Devil's Knight did not want others to see this battle. Previously, when Dongwang Zhengrong and Hayakuten fought, there was no one watching. At the same time, inside the barrier. "Nie Tian, this is a sealed barrier. You and I will fight here. It is fair and square." Devil's Knight's eyes flashed with cold light. He said, "As long as you defeat me, the barrier will be automatically removed. But I think you won't be able to see the scene of the barrier being removed." "Cut the crap," Nie Tian replied coldly, but inwardly he relaxed a little. He thought that Devil's Knight would fight him directly in the 1,000 layers of Ghost Domain. That would undoubtedly put more pressure on him. Right now, inside the barrier, it was indeed fair and square. "Oomph!" Devil's Knight snickered. Then, a black sword appeared in his hand. Instantly, a gloomy atmosphere pervaded the air like an invisible giant hand. Nie Tian felt the pressure. Devil's Knight was much scarier than he had imagined. This was his second time fighting against Devil's Knight, but he felt like it was a lifetime ago. This is my sword. It is called Darkness of Sky. Devil's Knight spoke in a low voice and arrogantly said, "Come and try. Let's see how many swords you can block under Darkness of Sky." Bzzz. As soon as he finished speaking, Darkness of Sky let out a low hum. Then, sword shadows shot out like a waterfall towards Nyetion. Nyetion's eyes flickered. He unsheathed the sword in the sky. Boundless sword intent erupted. Sword shadows rushed out like dragons, clashing against Devil's Knight. Bang! In the next moment, there was a muffled sound in the air. The two swords clashed, creating waves of energy that resembled a devouring beast. Nyetion retreated rapidly. While he was still in midair, blood trickled down the corner of his mouth. On the other hand, Devil's Knight was as still as a bell, as steady as a boulder. The first clash of swords had determined the victor. Nyetion steadied himself and took a deep breath. Only then did his pale face soften a little. "Nyetion, is this all you've got?" Devil's Knight snickered arrogantly. "If this is all you've got, then it's too disappointing." Boom! With these words, he slashed his sword down again, carrying a torrential aura that shot directly towards Nyetion. Nyetion's reaction was extremely fast. The sword in the sky reversed the momentum and blocked the fatal sword attack. However, he was injured once again. Then, without waiting for Nyetion to steady himself, an even sharper sword shadow fell like a storm, forcing Nyetion to retreat continuously. "Nyetion, you're too weak. You'll definitely die in this battle." Devil's Knight clamored madly. The dark sky left a cold scar in the air, like a mark of death. And with every strike, an additional wound appeared on Nyetion's body. In the blink of an eye, dozens of strikes had passed. Nyetion had been forced to the edge of the enchantment. His whole body was dripping with blood. In particular, his wrist was bleeding from the webbing between his thumb and forefinger. His hand was torn, and he could not even hold his sword steadily. He did not expect Devil's Knight to be so terrifying. Fortunately, they were inside the enchantment. If they were in the Thousand Layers ghost domain, perhaps Nyetion would not even be able to block a single strike. "What? You can't even hold your sword?" Devil's Knight held his sword horizontally and stared at Nyetion with a pair of sharp eyes. He laughed coldly. He enjoyed Nyetion's current predicament, which gave him a hysterical sense of satisfaction. "Devil's Knight, your strength is indeed beyond my expectations, but it won't be that easy for you to kill me." Nyetion took a step forward and said cold. Then, dark lines appeared on his face. It was the divine demon inverse mark. Divine demon body? Devil's Knight looked at Nyetion and sneered. "Do you think you're the only one with it?" As soon as he finished speaking, dark lines appeared on his face like a brand. They were even deeper and darker than Nyetion's divine demon inverse mark. Chapter 4267. Nyetion had activated his fiend god physique, but he didn't think that Devil's Knight would do the same. Plus, Devil's Knight's fiend god physique was even more terrifying. "Nyetion, in my eyes, all of your advantages are nothing but disadvantages." Devil's Knight's lips curled into a cold smile. The inscriptions on his face became even more obvious, making him look extremely evil. "Is that so?" Nyetion asked coldly, his devil god power surging madly around him like raging waves. Devil's Knight had inherited all his strength, even his fiend god embryo. His fiend god strength was even more terrifying. "You will soon find out how big the gap between us is." Devil's Knight sneered and moved. On the dark sword of heaven, black sword intent surged, and a gigantic sword shadow appeared, as if it wanted to drown the entire heaven and earth. Nyetion instantly felt an oppressive pressure. His heart couldn't help but shiver. Emoya's strength had far exceeded his expectations. It was simply too terrifying. "Accept your death." Right at this moment, Devil's Knight roared. The black sword shadow descended, and instantly, the heaven and earth seemed to be collapsing. Waves of energy swept over everything and pressed towards Nyetion. Nyetion's eyes flickered. The sword of sky shot out. Its sword intent whistled like thunder, accompanied by the roar of a dragon. The heaven and earth shook. Boom! In the next moment, The two terrifying forces collided, shaking the entire space. Violent waves of chi rose to the sky and expanded in all directions. At the same time, outside the enchantment, Qing Chi watched as the enchantment shook. His eyes couldn't help but shiver. The shock in his heart was written all over his face. Nie Tian. Rui Qinyu was also worried. She frowned. Her eyes trembled and her palms were sweating. Don't worry. I believe that Nie Tian will win. Qing Chi said in a deep voice. That year, Lord Dongwang Zhengron won the first battle against Hayakuten very easily. Although Nie Tian's power is slightly weaker than Devil's Knight's, I firmly believe that his strength is comparable to that of Devil's Knight. His temperament is incomparable to that of Devil's Knight. Although he was comforting her, Qing Chi's voice was clearly uncertain. If Nie Tian was only slightly weaker than Devil's Knight, he would still have confidence in Nie Tian. But the problem was that Devil's Knight was obviously much stronger than Nie Tian. With such a great disparity in strength, what were the chances of Nie Tian winning? I believe in him. Rui Qinyu frowned. Suddenly, a strange light flashed in her eyes, and she said in a serious tone. Qing Chi was stunned. He could clearly feel the trust Rui Qinyu had in Nie Tian. Inside the barrier, the great battle was still ongoing. The battle between gods and demons was extremely fierce. Under the situation where both sides had activated their demon god bodies, the two fought with all their strength. Nie Tian's body was dripping with blood. Only his eyes were still sharp and emitting a strong will to fight. On the other hand, Devil's Knight also suffered some injuries, but obviously not serious. Nie Tian, I feel what you've been through. Devil's Knight stood cold in the air and said coldly, I know that you're best at turning the tables in adversity. But that's when you're facing opponents who don't understand you. I know you very well. It's impossible for you to turn the tables in my hands. As soon as he finished speaking, his figure moved again. A pair of dark wings appeared on his back, making him look like a big bird. The dark sky in his hand fell again, and the tremendous sword will swept everything. Nie Tian's eyes were gloomy, but there was calmness in them. He had experienced countless battles of life and death in his life, but none of them were as cruel and tragic as this. Devil's Knight was too terrifying. He was too strong an opponent. Bang! In an instant, the two fought with all their strength again. After a muffled sound, Nie Tian's figure flew backward like a kite with a broken string. How about it? How many more attacks can you block? Devil's Knight sneered. Suddenly, the barrier was filled with a vast and boundless dark aura, extremely cold. He's too strong. If I want to beat him, I have to do what he doesn't dare to do. Nie Tian steadied himself and calculated in his heart. In the past, when he fought with other martial artists, his biggest advantage was his martial body, because his martial body far surpassed martial artists of the same level. Even those who were a level higher than him could not compare to him. But now, facing Devil's Knight, Nie Tian had no advantage at all. Moe possessed an even stronger fiend god power, a stronger defying the stars power, a stronger dragon vein, and a stronger martial body. This battle is starting to make me feel bored. It's time to end it. At this time, Devil's Knight said in a cold voice. Suddenly, the astral powers in his body burst out, rolling like a tide, as if to devour and crush everything. Nie Tian's face darkened slightly, and there was a touch of ruthlessness in his eyes. Boom! At this moment, Mo Ye's sword slashed down. Under the stimulation of defying the stars, his sword intent was greatly enhanced. The dark sword shadow was like a giant hand from the primordial era, majestic and majestic, smashing everything in its path. At the same time, Nie Tian's figure moved. Unexpectedly, he did not dodge at all, but directly rushed over. At this moment, the astral bloodline in his body erupted, and the bright astral power surged out like a falling galaxy. Roar! In the endless astral light, a giant red dragon appeared. With a roar, it resisted the dark sword shadow head-on, but it could not withstand the huge force and directly shattered. However, it was this split second that gave Niet Tian a chance to catch his breath. In the next moment, Niet Tian rushed forward, all kinds of power gushing out of his body like an erupting volcano. Devil's Knight looked at Niet Tian, his eyes trembling. He obviously hadn't expected the latter to be so crazy, but he wasn't afraid. "You want to fight me to the death? Do you think you have a chance?" Before he could finish his sentence, a gigantic totem appeared. It was like a screen in the sky, rolling and enveloping the area. Heaven-shrouding totem. Devil's Knight laughed contemptuously. He didn't understand why Niet Tian was risking his life. Did he want to defeat him with a heaven-shrouding totem? But in the next moment, he felt a sudden pressure, and the smile on his face froze. Just then, an enormous eye appeared above the heaven-shrouding totem, shining with starlight. It was the eye of the starry sky. Next, an enormous crucible descended from the eye of the starry sky, the Hellfire Crucible. Before Devil's Knight could even react, he was already inside the Hellfire Crucible. Meanwhile, outside of the Hellfire Crucible, a sword formation and an enormous enchantment appeared. It was none other than the Starry Sky sword formation and the Starry River airlock. Within the sword formation, a majestic aura flowed. It was none other than the energy of a saint. All of this happened in the blink of an eye, during which Niet Tian drew upon all of the power in the ninefold Starry River. But right now, he was trembling, his face as white as paper, and his blood energy was surging. "Niet Tian, you think you can trap me with this much power? You're too naive." Devil's Knight roared from within the Hellfire Crucible, unleashing a burst of power that shook the crucible, but failed to break it open. "How could this be?" Devil's Knight cried. Given how strong Niet Tian was, how could he possibly trap him? The next moment, he seemed to understand something and shouted again, "Blood Chi." He could smell a strong blood energy, and could tell that Niet Tian was burning his own blood energy to stimulate the heaven-shrouding totem and the Hellfire Crucible. Chapter 4268. 1,000 Layers of Ghosts. Outside the enchantment. Qing Chi stared at the enchantment, his archaic eyes trembling. He could actually see a thick blood energy leaking out of the enchantment, causing it to be covered in a faint layer of blood. With such a huge amount of blood and Qi leaking out, one could imagine how fierce the battle inside the barrier was. "That's Niet Tian's blood energy," Rui Qinyu said, her eyes trembling. A complex expression could be seen on her face, and it was hard to tell if she was worried or worried about something else. "Yeah," Qing Chi said, nodding. How could he not sense Niet Tian's blood energy? He just hadn't said anything about it. Judging from the current situation, Niet Tian was either seriously injured or was burning his blood energy to fight. Either way, it was extremely bad for Niet Tian. Meanwhile, inside the enchantment, the Hellfire Crucible roared, and Devil's Knight was surrounded by hellfire. The flames were like snakes of fire that slammed into him, but couldn't hurt him in the slightest. Even though Niet Tian was burning his blood energy, he could only temporarily trap Devil's Knight. "Idiot!" Devil's Knight growled. Although the Hellfire Crucible couldn't kill him, being trapped by Niet Tian left him feeling incredibly frustrated. He had never imagined that Niet Tian would be able to fight back in such a dire situation. However, the Hellfire Crucible, Shroud Heaven Totems, Starry Sky, Sage Energy, Starry Sky, Sword Formation, and Starry River Airlock were all being used up. Niet Tian's blood energy wouldn't last much longer. Niet Tian's actions were nothing short of a Pyrrhic victory. He was killing 800 enemies, but sacrificing 1,000 of his own. "Let's see how much longer you can hold out, Niet Tian," Devil's Knight said, laughing maniacally. As soon as Niet Tian couldn't hold out any longer, he would open the Hellfire Crucible. Good and evil exist together. Light and darkness accompany one another. Niet Tian was bathed in blood as he stood there. The blood energy around his body surged like rain as he spoke in a low voice. A wisp of a pale smile appeared on the corners of his mouth as he said, "Devil's Knight, since we were born together, then we should die together. Live and die together?" When Devil's Knight heard Niet Tian's words, His dark eyes couldn't help but shrink. Then he suddenly realized something and shouted, "Nietion, what do you want to do?" Even as the words left his mouth, the flames in the hellfire crucible exploded with power, transforming into crimson blades that began to devour everything in their path. In the blink of an eye, Devil's Knight sensed that something was amiss. He furrowed his brows, and immediately the power in his body surged out, but he was unable to withstand the burning power of the hellfire. In the blink of an eye, his entire body was riddled with holes. How is this possible? Moe cried out as a terrifying burning pain spread throughout his body. Nietion's voice rang out in Devil's Knight's ears like a death knell. Devil's Knight, it's true that I'm not as strong as you, but do you have the resolve to live and die together? You madman, Devil's Knight howled. He knew exactly what Nietion was trying to do. Nietion was burning his own blood energy and at the same time draining his bloodline power. He was going to use the hellfire crucible to consume him. Of course, the price he had to pay was that Nietion would die. This was what Nietion meant when he said they would live and die together. You have 10 seconds, Nietion said in a deep voice. You can choose to end the battle here. Isn't it just mutual destruction? Bring it on. Moe, on the other hand, laughed crazily as if he had gone mad. He shouted, I think you have a lot more things to worry about in this world than me. I won't lose out if you accompany me in death. Is that so? Nietionling said, smiling. What about your obsession? If you die now, then you'll never be able to defeat me. You'll always be my vassal. You'll always be my shadow. As soon as the words left his mouth, Devil Knight sensed that the flames in the hellfire crucible were even more terrifying than before, as though they were about to burn him to death. Outside the barrier, Qingqi and Rui Qinyu stared at it with bloodshot eyes. Their nerves were stretched taut, and their hearts were in their throats. They didn't even dare to breathe. They knew that the fight inside the barrier was reaching its climax, and that victory would be decided soon. If the person who emerged from the barrier wasn't Nietion, then everything would be over. Inside the ward, Nietion's flesh aura surged and burned madly like flames. He could clearly feel that his bloodline power was weakening at an alarming rate. The hellfire crucible was calm, and not a single sound could be heard. It was as if Devil's Knight had already made up his mind to take Nietion down with him. Time passed second by second, and Nietion felt as if a lifetime had passed with each passing second. 3, 2, 1. In the last second, Nietion steeled his heart, and his 9 dragon meridians roared as they burst into flames. If there was no other way out, then he had to walk the path of death. Stop! In that critical moment, Devil Knight's voice echoed out from the hellfire crucible, his voice like thunder, filled with rage and killing intent. In the next instant, the enchantment disappeared. Nietion's pupils constricted, and his 9 dragon meridians vanished. His tense body went limp, and he fell to the ground. Rui Qinyu froze for a moment, but then reacted, rushing over to catch Nietion. Nietion, I didn't lose, Nietion said, his mouth twitching. His face was frighteningly pale, and his aura was almost inaudible. Don't speak. Rui Qinyu's eyes flickered, and she sent some power into Nietion's body. His aura immediately recovered. Qingqi looked at the nearby Moe. The latter's face was so gloomy that it seemed like it was dripping with water, and he seemed like a man-eating beast. You didn't win either, Devil's Knight said, his eyes flashing with coldness. Qingqi frowned. He could guess that Nietion had used some sort of extreme method to force Devil's Knight to give up the fight. Nietion calmed down a bit and sat down cross-legged. About half an hour later, he was about 30% recovered. Nietion rose to his feet and looked at Devil's Knight. Devil's Knight, he said, the first fight isn't over. Once I'm back to full strength, we can continue. Count yourself lucky this time, Devil's Knight said, his expression cold and murderous. Next time, you won't be so lucky. Well, I'll wait and see, Nietion said with a faint smile. The fight with Devil's Knight just now had been extremely dangerous. Nietion had been seriously injured, and his blood vessels had been damaged. However, he had also discovered that Devil's Knight was in the same predicament he had been in before. The power within him was too complex and mixed. Conflict. It was obvious that Devil's Knight's body had not formed the star bloodline, which was why Nyetian could suppress him with the star bloodline. And it was precisely because the different powers in Devil's Knight's body were stronger than Nyetian's that it was more difficult to integrate them. Chapter 4269. Let's go, Devil's Knight said, cold and gloomy in the 1,000 layers of ghost domain. Devil's Knight, I need you to take me to someone, Nyetian said with a frown. No matter who you want to see, you have to leave this place first, Devil's Knight said coldly, clearly a little impatient. Nyetian nodded and let out a long breath, calming his expression. Devil's Knight led Nyetian and the others out of the 1,000 layers of ghost domain very quickly. What's that? Nyetian asked as he walked out of the 1,000 layers of ghost domain and saw a huge black vortex floating above. It was like a dark cloud, constantly releasing a dense space-time aura. The entrance to the city of ghosts, Devil's Knight said indifferently. Then he moved and directly charged into the black vortex. His figure disappeared into the vortex in an instant. Nyetian glanced at Rui Qinyu and Qingyi, nodded slightly, then followed. The three of them passed through the black vortex and arrived in a whole new world. They were currently standing on a wide street, surrounded by people, bustling with activity. It was actually a bustling market. This is the city of ghosts. Nyetian frowned, finding it a little unbelievable. He had imagined the city of 10,000 ghosts to be a relatively dark place, a gloomy place that never saw the light of day. However, it was no different from the large cities of other saints' worlds. It was even busier than regular cities. Follow me. At this moment, Devil's Knight said cold. Nyetian nodded and immediately followed. Nyetian, are you all right? Qingqi followed beside Nyetian and asked secretly. I'm fine. Nyetian smiled faintly, indicating that he was fine. Just now, he had burned his blood chi in the barrier and damaged his bloodline. His injuries were extremely severe. Now that he had recovered a little, all he needed to do was to quietly recuperate. Originally, he thought that it would be very difficult to recover from the damage to his bloodline, and there was even a possibility that he might not be able to recover at all. But now, it seemed that he had been too worried. The star bloodline was very different from ordinary bloodlines. It seemed to have the ability to heal itself. Based on how comfortable he was now, it would only take him about half a month to completely recover. Qingqi's eyes narrowed slightly, and his divine sense swept over Nyetian's body. After a long time, he nodded. He could tell from Nyetian's injuries that the latter must have damaged his bloodline by burning his blood chi. Usually, such injuries were irreversible and almost impossible to recover from. However, Nyetian's martial body was different from ordinary people. Not only did he recovered very quickly, which greatly exceeded Qingqi's expectations. The three of them followed behind Devil's Knight, and soon entered a narrow alley. Nyetian could clearly perceive that there was a strong aura surging in the surrounding space. Obviously, this was not an ordinary alley. This guy brought us here, he won't do us harm, right? Qingqi became vigilant, and secretly transmitted his voice to Nyetian. I don't think so. Nyetian was very calm. If Devil's Knight wanted to kill them, he would have done it long ago. There was no need to go through so much trouble. Soon, they passed through the alley, and a secluded small courtyard appeared in front of them, elegant and unique. Devil's Knight entered the small courtyard with Nyetian and others. An old black-robed figure came out. Seeing Devil's Knight, he bowed his head very respectfully and said respectfully, "Young Master D, you're back." As for Nyetian and the others behind Devil's Knight, the old man acted as if he didn't see them and completely ignored them. Devil's Knight slightly nodded, then looked at Nyetian and said, "Nyetian, if you want to see someone, just tell Elder Sure." Then he directly turned into the backyard. Nyetian frowned. Just as he wanted to open his mouth to stop Devil's Knight, the Elder Sure beat him to it. The latter's face was cold and solemn as he said, "Young Master D is tired. If you have something to say, tell it to I." Nie Tian was a bit helpless and could only nod. He could see that the person called Elder Shur was very respectful towards Devil's Knight. He seemed to be an old servant. Elder Shur, this junior is Nie Tian. Nie Tian looked at Elder Shur, faintly smiled, and said, I want to ask Elder Shur for a favor. Take us to see someone. Who? Elder Shur's face was indifferent, looking very impatient. The 10,000 ghost ancestor. Nie Tian said with a faint smile. You can't see this person. Find someone else. Elder Shur's eyes trembled slightly as he said coldly. Why? Nie Tian frowned and asked. There is no why. Elder Shur was very impolite and said coldly. What if I insist? Nie Tian's face sank. He suddenly couldn't restrain himself and said coldly. Then find someone else. Elder Shur's mouth twitched as he laughed. Nie Tian frowned, his face very ugly, and said, Elder Shur, taking us to see the 10,000 ghost ancestor is what Devil's Knight promised me. You don't want your young Master D to go back on his word, right? Guizhu has already passed away. How can you see him? Elder Shur hesitated for a moment before asking. Dead? Nie Tian's eyes trembled as he said in shock. Impossible. During the Hidden Dragon battle, he had just fought with the 10,000 ghost ancestor. How could the latter die so easily? You don't believe in I? Elder Shur's face was gloomy and seemed to be on the verge of losing his temper. You. Nie Tian was also a little angry. His fists slightly clenched, but he couldn't speak for a while. What about me? Elder Shur sneered, his face full of provocation. At this time, Qing Chi, who was standing off to the side, smiled faintly and walked up. He bowed deeply to the martial elder and said, Senior Evil Monarch, please calm down. Nie Tian is young and ignorant. Please forgive him if he has offended you. You know I? Elder Shur looked at Qing Chi, and his aged eyes suddenly shrank. He actually released a chilling evil aura as he coldly asked. When Junior was young, I had the honor to witness the battle between Senior Evil Commander and Sir Dongwang Zhengrong. Qing Chi smiled faintly and said respectfully, Elder Shur frowned as if he remembered something. He laughed and said, So you're the little boy who stayed by Dongwang Zhengrong's side. I didn't think you have grown up so much. It has been so many years, but Senior Evil Commander still remembers Junior. It is my honor. Qing Chi smiled and slightly bowed. There was no trace of pretense. It was obvious that he was very respectful towards the person before him. Seeing this, Nie Tian couldn't help but be surprised. He didn't think that this ordinary-looking elder would have such a high status. Even Qing Chi was so respectful towards him. Plus, this elder had fought against Dongwang Zhengrong, so he must be very powerful. Since you are the descendant of an old friend, there is no need to be so reserved. Elder Shur looked at Qing Chi, and his expression softened a lot. He said, After the fall of Dongwang Zhengrong, you juniors must have had a hard time. What do you want? Just say it. Yes. Qing Chi nodded and said, Actually, Junior wants to see the 10,000 ghost ancestor because I want to ask him some things. Since Senior Evil Commander is here, asking him will be the same. Ha! Evil Commander laughed twice, stroked his white beard, and said, In terms of age, this senior is older than Guizhu. Whatever Guizhu knows, this senior must also know. Ask away. Chapter 4270. After Qing Chi mentioned amorous affair, Elder Shurjin was shocked and stood rooted to the ground for a long time. With Elder Shurjin's temperament, he should have seen through everything. Why was he acting so strangely now? Looks like he knows about amorous affair, Nie Tian said in his heart as his eyes darkened. Senior Evil Dominator, if you know about amorous affair, please tell us. After a while, Qing Chi waited for Elder Shurjin to calm down before he said respectfully. Elder Shurjin took a deep breath and his aged face softened. However, his eyes were still flickering as if he was nervous. He asked, Why are you looking for amorous affair? This. Qing Chi's face stiffened and he was in a difficult position. The matter regarding Rui Qianyu was a taboo and it was not convenient to tell outsiders. If you don't tell me the truth, I will not tell you about amorous affair. Elder Shurjin frowned, and said cold. Qing Chi's face darkened, and he could not help but look at Nie Tian. He had no right to decide whether to tell Elder Shurjin the truth or not. He still needed Nie Tian's approval. Senior Evil Dominator, it's about the Emperor's palace. Nie Tian thought for a while and took a step forward to explain what had happened. However, he did not mention Rui Qianyu's 10 annihilation of the evil woman. The Emperor's palace wants to kill her. Elder Shurjin's eyes darkened after hearing Nie Tian's words. He looked at Rui Qianyu and said cold, "Then I want to know what kind of power she has in her body to make the Emperor's palace so afraid." Nie Tian's expression changed slightly. He was about to speak, but Rui Qianyu beat him to it. She said directly, 10 annihilation of the evil woman. Elder Shurjin's reaction was even more intense than before. His aged eyes suddenly narrowed as if he was struck by lightning. His entire body trembled involuntarily and then froze on the spot as if he had been petrified. Seeing Elder Shurjin's reaction, Nie Tian and Qing Chi could not help but look at each other. They did not expect Elder Shurjin to know about 10 annihilation of the evil woman. From the looks of it, he was very familiar with it. Why you really awakened the 10 annihilation evil woman? After a long time, Elder Shur finally reacted, but when he looked at Rui Qianyu, his eyes were filled with excitement and fear, and his voice was trembling. Rui Qianyu was very calm and nodded slightly. Heavens, after so many years, is the 10 annihilations really going to have a female empress? Elder Shur stared at Rui Qianyu for a long time, as if he was trying to confirm something. Then, he looked up to the sky and let out a long cry. When Nie Tian heard the empress from the elder's mouth, his eyes couldn't help but tremble in astonishment. The mysterious old man, Yu Jing, who had suddenly appeared, vowed to protect Rui Qianyu with his life, and he addressed Rui Qianyu as the empress. It was Yu Jing who told them to find amorous affair. And at this moment, the elder also mentioned the empress. How could he not be shocked? What do you mean by the empress? Rui Qianyu's beautiful eyes darkened, and she asked in a serious tone. Elder Shur's face was full of surprise and shock, and it took him a long time to recover, but he didn't answer Rui Qianyu. Instead, he said, "Your Majesty, please release the 10 annihilations, evil woman. I want to witness it with my own eyes." Rui Qianyu frowned and hesitated for a while, but she still released the 10 annihilations, evil woman bloodline. An extremely evil aura enveloped her body, giving people a chilling sense of oppression. The 10 annihilations, evil woman. It really is the 10 annihilations, evil woman. Elder Shur was shocked, and he almost cheered, but he couldn't help but look a little funny. Rui Qianyu's brows were tightly knitted, and she looked a little helpless. Nie Tian and Qing Chi were also speechless, and they could only watch quietly from the side. "Your servant, Shi Yuhua, greets your majesty." At this moment, Elder Shur made another shocking move, and he directly knelt in front of Rui Qianyu and kowtowed deeply. "Senior, what are you doing?" The sudden action caught Rui Qianyu off guard, and she immediately went forward to help him up. Perhaps Elder Shur was too excited. He stood up shakily and looked at Rui Qianyu with a face full of reverence and said, "The 10 annihilations, evil woman finally has an empress." "Senior, the empress you speak of, what does it mean?" Rui Qianyu suppressed the shock in her heart and asked in a low voice. "Your Majesty, don't be in a hurry. Let me explain slowly." Elder Shur smiled faintly and said, "But before that, I need to call young Master D out and let you two reunite." As he spoke, Elder Shur turned around and walked into the inner courtyard. Reunite? Rui Qianyu was confused, and she had no idea what was going on. She was no stranger to Devil's Night, and she also knew about Devil's Knight's background. What did Elder Shur mean by reuniting with him? Nie Tian and Qing Chi were also confused and could only wait for Elder Shur to return. After a while, Elder Shur came out from the inner courtyard with Devil's Knight. "Young Master D, come and greet the Empress," Elder Shur said excitedly, and walked quickly to Rui Qianyu's side with a smile. Devil's Knight's face was gloomy, and his brows were deeply furrowed, obviously unwilling. "Young Master D, This is the Empress, your mother. What are you still standing there for?" Seeing that Devil's Knight did not move, Elder Shur's attitude suddenly changed. He was no longer respectful, and even a little angry. "Mother!" When Rui Qinyu heard this form of address, her pretty face suddenly changed, and the corner of her mouth twitched a few times. Nie Tian and Qing Qi were even more puzzled. According to Elder Shur, Rui Qinyu seemed to be Devil's Knight's mother. But Nie Tian was very clear about Devil's Knight's background, and it had nothing to do with Rui Qinyu. "Your Majesty, although you are not young Master D's biological mother, in the future, you will grant him a new life, so you are his mother." Elder Shur looked at Rui Qinyu, bowed, and said. Rui Qinyu frowned, and she did not understand. "Your Majesty, you will understand what this old servant is saying in the future." Elder Shur smiled faintly, then looked at Devil's Knight coldly, and said in a deep voice, "Young Master D, are you still not going to bow?" Devil's Knight greets the Empress. Devil's Knight's face was very ugly, but he still bowed slightly. "How dare you?" However, Elder Shur suddenly roared, "Young Master D, Her Majesty is your mother. You have to kneel and pay respect to her." Devil's Knight suddenly raised his head and a pair of blood-red eyes, like a ferocious beast. "What? Are you going to disobey the Empress?" Seeing him like this, Elder Shur was even more furious and growled cold. At this time, Rui Qinyu spoke, and at this time, she said faintly, "Elder Shur, don't be so formal. Let him go first." Elder Shur frowned, and before he could say anything, Devil's Knight directly turned around and went into the inner courtyard. "Outrageous!" Elder Shur looked at Devil's Knight's back and said fiercely, "It's okay." Rui Qinyu, however, waved her hand and smiled faintly. "Elder Shur, I want to know what is going on." "Your Majesty, aren't you looking for amorous affair?" Elder Shur's face softened, and he smiled faintly and said, "This old servant is the person you are looking for." Rui Qinyu's beautiful eyes darkened, and she was momentarily stunned. Could it be that Elder Shur was amorous affair? Chapter 4271. In the small courtyard, Nie Tian and the others stared at the Grand Elder in astonishment. It took them a few seconds to react. How could they have imagined that the dying old man in front of them was the romantic flower snow moon that Yu Jing had mentioned? Seeing the reactions of Nie Tian and the others, Elder Shur could only smile helplessly. After a moment, Nie Tian finally calmed down and took a deep breath before asking, "Grand Elder, you said that you're the moon in Windflower, Snow Moon. Does that mean that there are 3 other people in Windflower, Snow Moon?" "Yes." The Elder nodded and sighed. Feng Hua Shui Yu's true identity is the 4 great evils of the Ghost Clan. The 4 great evil lords. Qing Qi's eyes trembled. He seemed very shocked. Of course, Elder Shur knew what Qing Qi was thinking. He faintly smiled and said, "You didn't expect it, did you? The 4 great evil sovereigns actually exist." Qing Qi nodded heavily and said, "Junior once learned from Easter Emperor that in addition to the ghost race and the Lord of 10,000 Ghosts, the ghost race also has the 4 great evil seniors." However, at that time, Lord Dongwang had also questioned the existence of the 4 evil lords. Since he hasn't seen the 4 great evil sovereigns with his own eyes, he suspects that the 4 great evil sovereigns are just a rumor spread by the ghost race to intimidate other races. Elder Shur chuckled and said, "Back then, it was I who revealed the existence of the 4 great evil exalts to Dongwang Zhengrong. Moreover, he told him that I was only one of the 4 great evil exalts, and he was the weakest amongst them. Who would have thought that this old bastard would, however, I doubt I's words." Qing Qi let out a hollow laugh and said nothing. Since Elder had fought against Dongwang Zhengrong before, it meant that both of them were at the same level. Even if there was a difference in strength, there shouldn't be much of a difference. Elder Shur was already terrifying enough in the ghost race, but there were still 3 existences that were as famous as Elder Shur or even stronger than him. How could Dongwang Zhengrong not be suspicious? Very few people in the world know about the 4 great evil lords, and even fewer know about amorous affair. Elder Shi smiled and continued. Since that Yu Jing knows about amorous affair, he must be one of the higher-ups of the 10 Annihilations clan. Grand Elder, what's going on with the Empress? Rui Qinyu calmed down and asked in a deep voice. Elder Shi faintly smiled and let out a long sigh. He seemed to have recalled many things and said, before the primordial era, the ghost race was divided into 4 branches. The 10 Annihilation branch, the Underworld branch, the Desolate Flow branch, and the Abyss branch. Right now, the Thousand Layers Ghost Domain and the City of 10,000 Ghosts are basically all ghosts of the Desolate Stream lineage. As for the 10 Annihilations lineage, they lived in the 10 Annihilations heavenly prison that very few people knew about. The Abyss lineage resides in the eternal abyss that never sees the light of day. At this point, the elder involuntarily paused. What about the Nether bloodline? Nietian frowned and couldn't help but ask. The Nether race went extinct a long time ago. There are no longer any Abyss devils in the Saints world. Elder Shi sighed. His expression was rather strange. There had to be a story behind this. However, Nietian's eyes slightly darkened as he thought of something. Jun Aoqing's real name was Flawless Yuming, the princess of the Yuming family. Could she be from the extinct Abyss devils? However, he was only guessing and didn't ask Elder Shi. What does this have to do with the Empress? Rui Qinyu was a little anxious and couldn't help but ask. Of course it's related. Elder Shi faintly smiled and gestured for Rui Qinyu not to be too anxious. He said, among the 4 branches of the ghost race, the 10 Annihilation branch is the strongest. Throughout history, the Lord of all ghosts basically came from the 10 Annihilation branch. But in the primordial era, because the 10 Annihilation branch was too powerful, it incurred the calamity of extinction. At that time, the 10 Annihilation branch suffered the most tragic massacre. Of the entire clan, not even 1 in 10,000 survived. Those who were lucky enough to survive eventually distanced themselves from the heavenly sacred world. They hid in the 10 Annihilation heaven prison. However, the people of the 10 Annihilation clan did not forget the hatred of extinction. They have always been waiting for the opportunity for revenge for the legendary 10 Annihilation evil woman to come. Nietian's expression became slightly solemn. Although Elder Shi's explanation was simple, he could imagine the bloodshed at that time. He faintly felt that the disaster of the 10 Annihilation clan was very likely related to the Human Sovereign Palace. It could even be the plan of the Human Sovereign Palace. At this time, Elder Shi glanced at Rui Qinyu and said, the people of the 10 Annihilation clan must have sensed the awakening of the 10 Annihilation evil woman, so they sent Yu Jing out to find the Empress. So that's how it is. Rui Qinyu nodded slightly and then asked in confusion, then why did Elder Yu ask us to find Romance before he died? Romance is the 4 great evil lords of the ghost race. The reason why the ghost race created the 4 great evil lords was to protect the most important person of the ghost race, the 10 Annihilation Empress. Elder Shi nodded and said, the 10 Annihilation branch has always been regarded as the royal branch of the ghost race. When the 10 Annihilation branch was destroyed, the other 3 branches of the ghost race were also massacred. Not only was the 10 Annihilation branch waiting for the Empress to come, but the entire ghost race is waiting. As he spoke, Elder Shi was a little excited, his eyes surging with a fiery light. Waiting? Suddenly, Rui Qinyu laughed and said, waiting for the Empress to avenge you. Yes. Elder Shi nodded heavily and said, we have never forgotten the hatred of the 10 Annihilation. However, Rui Qinyu frowned slightly, as if in deep thought, and said, what if I don't want to avenge? Elder Shi was stunned and did not know what to do. In his opinion, the Empress was the leader of the ghost race. She should avenge her people. She must avenge her people. If I were really your Empress, I would protect my people, but the hatred of the past has nothing to do with me. Rui Qinyu spoke again cold. Elder Shi was stunned and could not speak for a long time. He did not think that Rui Qinyu would have such a thought. However, he was not in a hurry because Rui Qinyu had just returned to the ghost race. When she truly understood the ghost race, she would change her mind. Your Majesty, since you have returned to the ghost race, this old servant will inform the ghost lord and announce the Empress's arrival to the entire ghost race. Elder Shur quickly calmed down and said excitedly, "No need." But Rui Chinyu immediately waved her hand and said, "The news that I am the Empress cannot be leaked. It is fine as long as the 4 evil lords know." Elder Shur was stunned for a moment. He thought that Raindrop Chinya was worried and immediately said, "Your Majesty, don't worry. Although the human emperor's palace is powerful, they wouldn't dare to touch the city of 10,000 ghosts easily. Even if they do come, this old servant and the others will not let them. They will not harm Her Majesty." Rui Chinyu frowned, her expression cold, and said, "I said, it is fine as long as the 4 of you know." This Elder Shur was stunned again, hesitated, but still nodded in agreement. Chapter 42-72. Elder Shur agreed readily, but his expression was hesitant, which made Nyetan and the others tense up. "Is there a problem?" Rui Chinyu's beautiful eyes darkened as she asked. Looking at Elder Shur's expression, it seemed that the other 3 evil masters would not be easy to meet. "Your Majesty, to tell you the truth, the 3 old men are a bit strange, and they have been in retreat for many years. If you want to meet them, I'm afraid it will be troublesome." Elder Shur's expression was a bit awkward as he said hesitantly, "Grand Elder, could it be that they would dare not to meet the Empress?" Nietian frowned and asked with a smile. From Elder Shur's behavior, the Empress's position in the ghost race should be supreme, even higher than the Ghost Lord and Guei Zhu. Otherwise, Elder Shur would not kneel. If that was the case, it should be easy for the Empress to meet anyone. "Little friend Nietan, you don't know, but the 3 old men have bad tempers. They usually don't show up. Even I don't have many opportunities to meet them." Elder Shur knew what Nietian was thinking and sighed, "Your Majesty, although I am very noble, the 3 old men will not easily admit it." Nietian frowned again and thought, "They won't easily admit it, so why did you kneel?" However, this was just what he thought, so he naturally could not say it out loud. Instead, he said, "Then how can we meet them?" "Actually, it's not difficult to meet them, as long as we can pass the test they set up." Elder Shur looked at Nyetan, and his old eyes suddenly shot out a sharp light as he asked, "If I am not mistaken, little friend Nyetan should be a genius. A sword master." "You can say so." Nyetian's eyes narrowed, and he had a bad feeling in his heart, but he nodded lightly. "Little friend Nyetian, you are now in the 9th heavenly layer of Saint, right?" Elder Shur nodded with a smile and continued to ask. Nyetian nodded. "Saint Realm, Sword Tao, Sword Rhythm, Divine Decree, Sacred Meaning, Sword Heavenly Calamity, Sword Sense Against God, Sword Martial Saint." Elder Shur stared at Nyetian and couldn't help but smile. Stroking his white beard, he said, "My young friend Nyetian is so young, yet you have already reached the 9th sky of holy sense. It is indeed a good sword material. Elder, if you have something to say, just say it." Nyetian couldn't help but feel a bit impatient when he saw the elder's expression. "My young friend Nyetian, one of us venerables also excels in the way of sword." The test he had set before he went into seclusion was a sword formation. Before he went into seclusion, he said that as long as someone could break through the sword formation, he would be willing to become sworn brothers with that person. He stared at Nyetian with a burning gaze and said with a smile, "Sworn brothers?" Nyetian couldn't help but smile. This method was a little strange. Many experts would set up some tests, but generally speaking, those who passed the test would be accepted as disciples. It was rare to see someone like this person who swore an oath of brotherhood with a disciple. "My young friend Nyetian, the person I was talking about, is the head of the 4 venerables, Yin Feng Wu." Elder Shur smiled again as if he was a bit proud. He created countless legends in the sword world. Selfless sword master. Hearing the name Yin Feng Wu, Qin Chi's pupil shrank, and he was shocked on the spot. Nyetian's heart shuddered at Qin Chi's reaction. It seemed that this Yin Feng Wu had quite a background. "Oh, have you also heard of his famous name?" The elder couldn't help but look at Qin Chi with a smile. "Yes." Qin Chi calmed down and nodded. I have heard of this person from Senior in the sword world, but I didn't think that Senior's selfless sword master would be the head of the four venerables. Huh. Elder sure smiled and said, there are very few people in the world who know about the four venerables, so there is nothing strange about it. Senior venerables. I heard that Senior's selfless sword master was as famous as the Yang God Sword Emperor. Is that true? Qingqi nodded and asked carefully. Yang God Sword Emperor. Hearing this name, Nietian's heart suddenly trembled, and his expression changed. He never thought that selfless sword master would be as famous as the Yang God Sword Emperor. He had seen the Yang God Sword Emperor's strength with his own eyes. He was truly a person who could defy the heavens with his sword. However, Mori Shire once said that the Yang God Sword Emperor was the only person who had truly achieved the unity of man and sword. Moreover, the Yang God Sword Emperor used a broken sword to defeat all the experts in the heavens and reach the peak of the heavens. Would there be anyone else who could be as famous as him? Hearing Qingqi's words, Elder sure shook his head and said with a bitter smile, at that time, before the Yang God reached the unity of man and sword, he was already an invincible existence in the heavens. At that time, the only one who could compete with the Yang God and sword principle was Yin Fengwu. Only Yin Fengwu. One of them was called the Yang God Sword Emperor, and the other was called the Selfless Sword Master. So they were called one emperor and one demon by the sword world at that time. Unfortunately, the Yang God reached the unity of man and sword with the help of the natural sword embryo. After that, Yin Fengwu was no longer a match for the Yang God. When Elder Sure said this, he seemed to feel some regret and helplessness. So that's how it is. Qingqi nodded and said, however, for a period of time, I am afraid that only Senior Selfless Sword Master could be as famous as the Yang God Sword Emperor. Huh. Elder Sure looked at Qingqi and couldn't help but laugh. In fact, after the Yang God reached the unity of man and sword, he also fought with Yin Fengwu several times. Although Yin Fengwu was not born with a natural sword embryo, his understanding of sword principle has reached a level that ordinary people can't reach. Therefore, when Yin Fengwu fought with the Yang God, he gradually understood the mystery of the unity of man and sword. After that, he went into seclusion for hundreds of thousands of years. Finally, when he came out, he reached the unity of man and sword. This, Nietian and Qingqi were shocked at the same time and were stunned on the spot. Everyone thought that the Yang God Sword Emperor was the only swordsman to reach the unity of man and sword. They didn't expect that the Selfless Sword Master had also reached this level. What was even more terrifying was that the Selfless Sword Master had reached this level without the natural sword embryo. This understanding of sword principle could be said to be shocking. Although the Selfless Sword Master had borrowed the power of the Yang God Sword Emperor, his understanding of sword principle was absolutely unprecedented. Senior Evil Master. Did the Selfless Sword Master fight with the Yang God Sword Emperor later? Qingqi immediately reacted and was extremely excited, asking with a trembling voice. Elder Sure smiled again and said helplessly, when Yin Fengwu came out of seclusion, the Yang God had already disappeared. Sigh. Qingqi couldn't help but let out a long sigh and said, it's a pity that the two swordsmen who reached the unity of man and sword had no chance to fight. Yes, Elder Sure nodded with a smile, but his expression was very bitter, as if he was complaining for Yin Fengwu. Senior, why didn't Senior Yin Fengwu fight with other swordsmen to prove himself? At this time, Nietian couldn't help but ask. Logically speaking, with the disappearance of the Yang God Sword Emperor, wasn't this the time for Yin Fengwu to make a name for himself? Invincible in the holy world, it could be said that all the mountains were small. Yin Fengwu is not a person who seeks fame. Moreover, at that level, he has no interest in fighting with other swordsmen. Elder Sure said with a smile. Nietian smiled awkwardly and nodded slightly. Chapter 4273. Nietian was startled awake, and his heart couldn't help but sink. It seemed that Elder Sure wanted him to break the sword formation that Yin Fengwu had left behind. Yes, the Grand Elder nodded solemnly. He looked at Nie Tian with a burning gaze, as if he was observing the latter's reaction. Before Nie Tian could say anything, Qing Chi, who was standing to the side, exclaimed, "This isn't appropriate, right?" His face became somewhat unsightly. Yin Fenghua was once on par with the Yang God Sword Emperor. The strength of the sword formation that he had left behind was imaginable. Although Nie Tian was talented in swordsmanship, Qing Chi did not believe that the former could catch up to Yin Fenghua. After all, Yin Fenghua had said that anyone who could break his sword formation would be willing to become sworn brothers with him. From this, it could be seen that the sword formation that Yin Fenghua had left behind must be very difficult. Otherwise, how could he allow the person to break the formation to become sworn brothers with him? Elder Shi wanted Nie Tian to break the sword formation that Yin Fenghua had left behind. This was clearly putting Nie Tian in great danger. Elder Shi glanced at Qing Chi and said with a faint smile, "The sword formation that Yin Fenghua had left behind is indeed very dangerous. However, because it was left behind by Yin Fenghua, the sword essence and rhythm that it contains are absolutely what any swordsman dreams of." As he spoke, the corner of his mouth raised slightly. He looked at Nie Tian and said, "I think this is very beneficial to you." Nie Tian nodded, but didn't say anything. How could he not understand what Elder Shi meant? The sword formation that Yin Fenghua had left behind contained his own sword essence. The sword principle contained in the sword essence of this legend that was once on par with the Yang God Sword Emperor was something that no swordsman could resist. It could not be resisted. Swordsmanship needed to be comprehended, but if there was an expert to guide, it would undoubtedly be twice the result with half the effort. Just like Yin Fenghua, if he had not fought with the Yang God Sword Emperor, he would probably never be able to step into the realm of swordsmanship. If a swordsman could comprehend something from Yin Fenghua's sword formation, it would undoubtedly be a subversive help to his path of swordsmanship. Such a temptation was indeed difficult for any swordsman to resist. However, it was precisely because of this that it undoubtedly showed that boundless killing intent was hidden within the sword formation. Otherwise, all the swordsmen would definitely swarm outside the sword formation, waiting for an opportunity to enter. Grand Elder had long seen that Qing Chi's attitude towards Nie Tian was very respectful, and he was constantly protecting Nie Tian, so he used the sword array to lure Nie Tian. Senior Evil Master, the sword formation left by Senior Yin Fenghua is not that simple, is it? Qing Chi asked directly, having seen through the Elder's hidden meaning. Little friend Nie Tian, if you are interested, I can take you to see the sword formation right away. Elder Shi nodded and looked at Nie Tian. All right. Nie Tian smiled faintly and nodded happily. Qing Chi frowned and wanted to say something, but was stopped by Nie Tian with a wave of his hand. He was very worried that after seeing the sword formation, Nie Tian would not be able to resist the temptation. Then, Elder Shi was about to let Devil's Knight come out to say goodbye to Rui Qianyu, but was stopped by the latter. Elder Shi thought for a moment and did not insist. He immediately brought Nie Tian and the others to the sword formation. Under Elder Shi's lead, everyone left the city of 10,000 ghosts and set off for the Fenyu Mountains where the sword formation was located. About half a day later, Nie Tian and the others arrived at the demonic peak of the Fenyu Mountains. The cliffs are extremely high, and the peak is like a long sword. What a magnificent peak! Qing Chi looked at the peak in front of him and could not help but exclaim. Nie Tian's gaze fell on the peak of the mountain, and he could not help but nod his head. The demonic peak was nearly 1,000,000 meters high. It was shaped like a sharp sword, piercing into the boundless sky, and it was daunting. This is the demonic peak. The sword formation left by Yin Fenghua is at the peak. Elder Shi smiled faintly, and then his figure moved. Like a white light, he flew straight towards the demonic peak. Seeing this, Nie Tian and the others immediately followed. In the blink of an eye, they arrived at the periphery of the demonic peak. Suddenly, they felt the powerful sword intent in the surrounding space, and their expressions changed. This old thing's sword intent is indeed terrifying. At this moment, even Elder Shi's face could not help but darken slightly. Ching Chi's expression was shocked and embarrassed, and he could not help but look at Nye Tian. The latter was stunned for a long time before he finally let out a sigh of relief and said, "This level of sword intent can only be compared to the Yang God Sword Emperor." That day, when a Yang God Sword Emperor appeared, it gave Nye Tian a great shock and gave him a new understanding of the Sword Tao. And now, when he felt the level of sword intent of the unity of man and sword, his heart was also shaken. This kind of sword intent was as vast as the heaven and earth, as continuous as the sea, vast and endless. The majesty of the sword intent had the momentum to envelop the heaven and earth. After a moment, Nye Tian calmed down slightly. He could feel that the Yinfeng's selflessness and the Yang God Sword Emperor's sword intent were on the same level, but the concept was different. The Yang God Sword Emperor's sword intent was even more extreme, even more vigorous, giving off a feeling of bravery and light. On the other hand, the Yinfeng's selflessness sword intent was even more tyrannical, even sharper, as if it contained the power to destroy heaven and earth. Nian, the sword formation is on the sword discourse arena at the peak of the mountain. Do you dare charge in? At this time, Elder Shur spoke and asked with a faint smile. Nye Tian's gaze darkened as he locked onto the sword discourse arena at the peak of the mountain. He saw a small sword formation standing majestically, and the sword intent in the surrounding space was released from the sword formation. Nye Tian, this sword formation isn't something to be trifled with. You better think twice. Ching Chi was afraid that Nye Tian would agree without hesitation. Nye Tian smiled and nodded. He then looked at Elder Shur and asked, "Senior, may I ask if this sword array has a name?" "Of course." Elder Shur laughed and said, "This sword array is called the Seven Wounds Sword Array. Yinfeng Wua cultivates the Seven Wounds sword technique, and his killing intent is extremely strong. The Seven Wounds sword formation is derived from the Seven Wounds sword technique. Seven Wounding sword formation." Nye Tian's eyes narrowed as he sensed an extremely strong killing intent. Elder Shur suddenly let out a strange laugh and said, "When Yinfeng Wua first went into seclusion, many swordsmen tried to challenge the Seven Injuries sword formation. Among them, there were some genius swordsmen and even many famous swordsman masters. Unfortunately, not a single person. They succeeded, and their fates were extremely miserable." "Miserable?" Nye Tian's eyes trembled slightly, showing a peculiar interest. "Yes." Elder Shur nodded with a smile and said, "Half of the swordsmen who entered the Seven Wounds sword formation died instantly. As for the other half, although they were lucky enough to escape from the sword formation, they were either crippled or crippled. Many of them even lost their minds. Madmen." This, hearing what Elder Shur said, Ching Chi couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. Nye Tian didn't have much of a reaction. With a calm face, he waited for Elder Shur to continue. Elder Shur once again looked at Nye Tian and smiled, saying, "Yinfeng Wu's Seven Wounds sword intent is extremely overbearing. One sword, 7 wounds, penetrating into the bone and marrow. Back then, even a Yang God Sword Emperor was injured by the 7 Wounds sword intent. The 7 Wounds sword formation perfectly inherited the overbearing 7 Wounds sword intent." Chapter 4274. Nye Tian smiled confidently as he looked at the 7 Wounding sword formation. "Nye Tian, don't be rash," Ching Chi exclaimed after he regained his senses. Elder Shur, on the other hand, smiled meaningfully without saying a word. Everything was within his expectations. He could tell that Nye Tian would definitely attempt the 7 Wounding sword formation. "Nye Tian, I don't have to meet this person. You have to think it through," said Rui Qinyu softly, as she also knew how dangerous the 7 Wounding sword formation was. She was not trying to dissuade Nye Tian. She would support whatever decision he made, but she did not want him to take the risk because of her. "I've thought it through." Nye Tian smiled faintly, his eyes brimming with confidence. Nye Tian had considered many things before he decided to attempt the 7 Wounding sword formation. Yinfeng Wua was the leader of romance. As long as he could let Rui Qinyu meet him, Rui Qinyu would be very safe. Yin Fenghua was a swordsman who was on par with the young Godsword Emperor. One could imagine how powerful he was. Even the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master might not be a match for Yin Fenghua. In that case, if the Human Emperor Palace really wanted to pursue Rui Qinyu, they would have to send out even more powerful figures from the Human Emperor Palace. In fact, Nie Tian felt that even the current Human Emperor might not be a match for Yin Fenghua. Therefore, if he could hire such a protector for Rui Qinyu, she would naturally not be afraid of the Human Emperor Palace. On the other hand, Nie Tian was thinking about himself. The 7 wounding sword formation was indeed dangerous, but also contained great opportunities. This was a fatal temptation to any swordsman. More importantly, he had 3 fights with Devil's Knight. Therefore, he needed to improve his abilities as soon as possible. Although there was no clear winner in the previous fight, he knew that Devil's Knight had an overwhelming advantage over him. Therefore, for the sake of the next battle, he had to take the risk. Seeing that Nie Tian had already made up his mind, Qing Chi's expression became unsightly, and he was momentarily speechless. For a person like Nie Tian, once he made a decision, he wouldn't change his mind easily. He had to break through this sword formation no matter what. Rui Qinyu didn't have much of a reaction. She just nodded slightly. Little friend Nie Tian, the 7-wound sword formation is different from ordinary sword formations. Any swordsman who enters the sword formation will be able to summon a power that is related to the swordsman's realm. At this time, Elder Shi looked at Nie Tian and said, "Your cultivation is only at the first level of the Heaven Tribulation, and your Sword Dao realm is only at the 2nd level. It's the 9 heavens of heavenly justice. This is a huge advantage for you." Nie Tian smiled faintly. Of course, he understood the elder's meaning. The 7 wounding sword formation was left by the selfless sword demon, intended to test the swordsman's talent in swordsmanship, not to test the swordsman's strength. If it was a simple test of strength, perhaps no one would be able to break through Yin Feng's selfless sword formation. Nie Tian's strength and realm were both very weak, so the power that he could summon from the sword formation was relatively weak. On the other hand, his martial body was strong, so this became his advantage. "Please." Elder Shi smiled faintly, then flashed to the side. He really wanted to see how long Nie Tian could last in the 7-wound sword formation. Of course, he didn't believe that Nie Tian could break through the 7-wound sword formation. In his opinion, no one in this world could break through the 7-wound sword formation, because he didn't believe that there could be a swordsman as terrifying as Yin Feng's selfless sword formation in this world. Nie Tian nodded slightly. Then his figure moved like a sword light, directly entering the 7-wound sword formation. What a domineering sword intent! The moment he entered the formation, Nie Tian immediately felt the terrifying sword intent in the void around him. He couldn't help but feel his heart tighten, and he exclaimed. He was already prepared in his heart, knowing that after he entered the formation, his sword intent would definitely be suppressed, because he was facing a legendary swordsman in the realm of one with the sword. But he didn't expect Yin Feng's selfless sword intent to be so domineering. At this moment, he felt like his whole body was being pressed against by countless sharp swords. If he moved even a little, the sharp swords would instantly tear him to pieces. Compared to the young God-sword emperor, Yin Feng's selfless sword intent was more ferocious and sharp. But he quickly calmed down, took a deep breath, then slowly closed his eyes, carefully feeling the sword intent in the surrounding space. What is Nie Tian doing? Qing Chi saw from afar that Nie Tian was not moving, and he couldn't help but frown and ask. Not bad. Elder Shi pursed his lips and smiled, praising. Once an ordinary swordsman entered the 7-wound sword formation, they would feel an extremely strong sword intent pressure and then immediately panic, directly triggering the sword formation's killing intent and be killed on the spot. Although Nie Tian's realm was not high, and he was very young, his state of mind was much better than an ordinary swordsman's. According to Elder Shi's observation, if Nie Tian directly resisted just now, he would most likely be a corpse. But next, can you break through the first sword intent pressure? Elder Shur then smiled and said, the first sword intent pressure will get stronger and stronger. The more you hesitate, the more dangerous it will be. The first sword intent pressure of the 7-wound sword formation would get stronger and stronger, and in this way, Nyetian would be in more and more danger. Bang! Just as he finished speaking, Nyetan, who was in the sword formation, moved. The sword intent around him burst forth, and he actually forcefully broke through the sword intent pressure. Such a scene made Elder Shur's eyes narrow, and he immediately let out a cry of surprise. He didn't expect Nyetian's sword intent to be so strong that it could easily break through the first sword intent pressure. It seemed like Nyetian was much stronger than he imagined. Inside the sword formation, Nyetian had just broken through the first sword intent pressure when he immediately felt a terrifying killing intent above his head. It made his heart quiver. In that instant, he didn't raise his head. Instead, he swung his sword, and a terrifying sword intent shot up into the sky, resisting the pressure above his head. Bang! After a muffled sound, Nyetian's body shook, and he spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. His face was as white as paper. Idiot! Elder Shur frowned and thought. It seems like I overestimated you. You dare to fight against the 7 wounds sword formation head-on. You're seeking death. The 7 wounds sword formation was extremely overbearing, but Nyetian chose to fight it head-on. This was seeking death. Even so, the sword intent pressure still couldn't kill Nyetian. It merely injured him. Nyetian. Qingqi saw that Nyetian was injured and couldn't help but panic. You'll be fine. Trust him, Rui Qianyu, who was standing to the side, said calmly. Qingqi's eyebrows furrowed. It seemed that everyone who was close to Nyetian had an indescribable trust in him. No wonder he is a swordsman who has become one with the sword. His sword intent is indeed strong. Inside the sword formation, Nyetian steadied himself. Blood still dripped from the corner of his mouth, but his eyes were shining with excitement. He had fought against many swordsmen of the same level and had never lost. But now, against the 7-wound sword formation, he lost. He could feel that this was a sword intent of the same level as him, but it easily defeated him. This meant that Infeng Anita, who was of the same level, was much stronger than him. Chapter 4275. Infeng Wu's 7 wounds sword essence was incomparably powerful. Within its domineering aura, it was even scarier than the Yang God Sword Emperor's. But at this moment, Nyetian did not feel the slightest bit of fear. All he felt was a strong desire to fight. Just then, within the 7 wound sword array, a clear hum of a sword rang out. Then, a shadow of a sword appeared. Immediately, the surrounding space was shrouded in a murderous aura. What a terrifying killer's intent. Nyetian's heart skipped a beat. He quickly retreated and swung the sky, sword in his hand. The shadow of the sword was like a dragon, howling and roaring. Bang! In the next moment, the 2 shadows of the sword clashed together. A terrifying wave of sword waves formed, and chilling killer's intent spread. Caught off guard, Nyetian's shoulder was cut to the bone. Nyetian steadied himself, still fearless. The corner of his lips curled into a cold smile. He was like a bloodthirsty beast. Then, several more shadows of the sword appeared. Every time they landed, they left a deep cut on his body. In the blink of an eye, he was covered in blood. It was a tragic sight. Qingqi witnessed this scene from outside the array. His eyes trembled uncontrollably and his heart was in his throat. At this moment, even Rui Qianyu's expression changed. She was visibly nervous. Elder Shur frowned. He did not look worried, but rather confused. He did not think that Nyetian would be able to last this long within the 7 wound sword array. Ordinary swordsmen, once injured by the 7 wounds sword essence, would immediately lose their ability to fight. However, Nyetian was clearly heavily injured, and yet he was still standing. This was truly puzzling. Once the 7 wounds sword essence enters the body, it will destroy the swordsman's internal organs. This kid has been injured to this extent by the 7 wounds sword essence, yet he seems to be fine. This is too strange. Elder Shur's eyes were bright as he thought to himself. Could it be that his sword essence can really contend against the 7 wounds sword essence? The only explanation for the fact that Nietian was injured and didn't fall was that the sword intent within his body wasn't any weaker than the 7 injuries sword intent. Therefore, he was able to resist the power of the 7 injuries sword intent. Of course, Shirlao could also see that Nietian's martial body was far more powerful than other martial artists of the same level. Not only that, it was much more powerful. He was simply a freak. Senior Evil Dominator, can this sword array be stopped? Qing Chi anxiously asked as he watched Nietian's injuries worsen. The 7 injuries sword formation operates on its own and is not affected by external forces. Elder Shur frowned and said, Nietian can come out of the sword array now, but it seems that he doesn't want to give up. This is bad. Qing Chi suddenly panicked. How could he not understand Nietian's personality? He would not turn back even if he crashed into a wall. Before their eyes, there were only 2 outcomes. Nietian would either pass the sword array or die within it. Judging from the current situation, the latter was undoubtedly more likely. Inside the sword array, Nietian was bathed in blood, but he still stood there coldly. His eyes were filled with an unyielding light. The 7 injuries sword intent is indeed terrifying. I want to see how much my martial body can withstand. The corner of Nietian's mouth twitched. His eyes were filled with a profound smile. Then, the sword shadows fell one after another. He did not evade, but instead fought them head-on. Every time a sword mark appeared on his body, the impact on his martial body increased. Very quickly, his body was covered in sword marks. His entire body was covered in blood, and there was not a single piece of skin left unscathed. Nietian, what are you doing? Qing Chi was shocked by the scene before him and growled. In his opinion, Nietian clearly had a more reliable way to deal with the 7 injuries sword intent. But the latter chose to fight it head-on. This was simply asking for death. If Nietian had purposely avoided it, he would have been injured, but not so badly. Rui Qianyu's brows were tightly locked together. While she was worried, she seemed to be thinking about something. She knew Nietian very well. He must have a plan. Otherwise, he would not have put himself in such great danger. What Nietian was best at was putting himself at death's door. Is this young man crazy? Elder Shur did not understand Nietian at all, but he was very confused. He could tell that Nietian was purposely letting the 7 injuries sword intent enter his martial body. But to anyone else, this was tantamount to self-harm. However, Elder Shur had to admit that Nietian's martial body was indeed very powerful. It was much more powerful than he had imagined. Such a terrifying 7 injuries sword intent, even a holy emperor would not be able to withstand it. But Nietian was still standing. Such a martial body and such willpower was truly terrifying. Come, let me see exactly how terrifying the 7 injuries sword intent that can inflict 7 injuries with 1 strike is. Inside the sword array, Nietian seemed to have lost his mind. He no longer resisted and allowed the rays of sword intent to penetrate his body. His body was no longer just a mess of blood and flesh. It was completely deformed. Elder Shur and the others stared at Nietian in shock. They could not imagine what kind of willpower a martial artist must possess to not collapse under such circumstances. This madman, Elder Shur could not hold it in any longer, and he growled. Just as he finished speaking, Nietian, who was inside the sword array, made his move. Nietian stood still, bathed in blood. With a thought, the demonic energy inside his body burst forth. Terrifying life force exploded and lines of demonic and divine inscriptions appeared. His wounds began to heal at an extremely fast speed. Elder Shur could not believe what he saw. His eyes widened to the point that his eyeballs were about to fall out of their sockets. Nietian's martial body was broken into pieces by the 7 injuries sword intent. How could it still heal? Just what kind of power was hidden inside Nietian's body? Just as Elder Shur was wondering, something even more horrifying happened. Break! Within the sword formation, the corner of Nietian's mouth twitched, and he growled. Then the sword intent in his body suddenly burst out, and like a landslide or tsunami, a majestic sword intent suddenly rushed out, and like a hidden dragon breaking out of the abyss, it attacked the 7-wound sword formation. Bang! Crack, crack, crack. In the next second, a muffled rumble echoed. The entire sword array shook violently. Then it began to crumble. Hum! Immediately after, before the Grand Elder and the others could react, the sword formation actually exploded with a loud bang and directly collapsed. The collapse of the sword array triggered a boundless amount of energy that rolled in all directions. Elder Sure and the others, under the force of this attack, could not help but retreat. After a long while, the force of the attack slowly dissipated. However, Elder Sure and the others stood rooted to the ground as if they were petrified. It finally broke. In the air above the demonic peak, Niet Tian smiled. His face was as white as paper, and his silhouette was like a withered leaf in the wind. How is this possible? Far away, Elder Sure finally reacted. He screamed in shock as he stared at the blood-soaked swordsman in the sky. To his surprise, he completely understood how Niet Tian had broken the sword formation. Just then, the demonic peak suddenly rumbled and began to shake as if it was about to collapse. Chapter 4276. Rumble. The demonic mountain shook violently, and a series of roars spread, as if the heaven and earth were about to collapse. Niet Tian took a deep breath, and his figure moved, retreating thousands of meters away. Bang! Boom, boom, boom. At the next moment, an explosion sounded, and suddenly the demonic mountain collapsed. The huge mountain crashed to the ground, stirring up thousands of feet of dust. Niet Tian's figure retreated again, avoiding the impact of the airwaves. Seeing this, Qingqi directly flew to Niet Tian's side and said nervously, "Niet Tian, are you okay?" "I'm fine." Niet Tian took a deep breath and forced a smile. He was seriously injured, but his life was not in danger. Qingqi sensed Niet Tian's injury while injecting origin energy into the latter's body. After a while, Niet Tian's complexion improved a little, and his injury was much more stable. What a strong sword essence aura! Niet Tian gazed at the collapsed Heaven Demon Mountain and sensed an unusually powerful sword intent surging in the mountain, as if there was a giant beast hiding underground, ready to make a move. This aura, it should be the selfless sword demon. Qingqi also felt the restless sword essence aura, and his eyes trembled slightly as he said in a low voice, "Boom!" Just as the two of them finished speaking, the collapsed sky demon mountain suddenly exploded. Immediately, a majestic sword chi shot into the sky, pressing down on the surrounding space and causing it to suddenly tighten. It was enveloped by a terrifying sword intent, making it hard for people to breathe. A sense of pressure. Puff! Suddenly, Niet Tian felt the sword essence in his body agitated, and he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. Niet Tian. Qingqi couldn't help but change his expression, and once again injected origin energy into Niet Tian to help him stabilize his aura. Niet Tian took a deep breath, and then he slightly calmed down. There were still remnants of the 7 injuries sword essence in his body. The sword aura just now triggered the 7 injuries sword essence, and once again caused an impact on his martial body. After so many years, I have finally waited. Ha ha ha. At this moment, an incomparably majestic voice rang out, after which 10,000 beams of sword light blotted out the skies as a tyrannical silhouette appeared, akin to a peerless sword, standing tall between the heavens and earth. In the room, what a powerful aura! Niet Tian felt the oppressive aura and couldn't help but tremble in shock. However, in the next moment, he could not help but frown when he saw the figure in the sky. He couldn't believe his eyes. Standing in the middle of the 10,000 sword lights was an extremely short and fat old man. The old man's figure was exactly the same as Jean de Beo's from before. The only difference was that he was much smaller. Could this be the legendary, selfless sword demon? In the world of martial arts, strength was everything, so looks were not that important. However, if he grew up to look like the old man in front of him, he would feel a little strange. Ha ha! Quick, let this sovereign see who exactly broke this sovereign's sword formation. At this moment, the old man laughed and his figure moved. Like a ray of light, he instantly descended in front of Nietion. This guy is Yin Fenghua. Nietion frowned. He finally confirmed that this short and fat old man was the legendary selfless sword demon. It's you? Yin Fenghua looked at Nietion with a wrinkled face, as if he didn't believe it and was a little disappointed at the same time. Nietion also looked at Yin Fenghua with a strange feeling in his heart. When he looked at Yin Fenghua from afar, Yin Fenghua wasn't too short. Now that he was in front of him, he could see clearly that Yin Fenghua was only the height of a 10-year-old child. What was even more strange was that although Yin Fenghua's hair and beard were all white, there was not a single wrinkle on his face. His skin was also very white and tender. He didn't look like an old man at all, but more like a fat baby wearing a fake beard. Who would have thought that an existence comparable to the Sun God Sword Emperor would be like this? Then, Yin Fenghua looked at Nietion. The corner of his mouth twitched and said angrily, "Kid, I asked you a question. Didn't you hear me?" Junior Nietion. Nietion just reacted and immediately bowed. "I was lucky enough to break your sword formation. Please don't blame me, Senior." Blame? Yin Fenghua couldn't help but feel a little funny and said, "The reason why I left the 7-wound sword formation is to let others break it. You broke the sword formation. Of course I'm happy. There's nothing to blame." "Thank you, Senior." Nietion quickly nodded and said with a smile. However, he could see from Yin Fenghua's expression that the latter wasn't very happy. "Old Feng, congratulations on coming out of seclusion." At this time, Shi Lao came and slightly cupped his hands towards Yin Fenghua and said with a hearty smile. Yin Fenghua waved his hand impatiently, his eyes staring straight at Nietion, as if he was looking for something. After a moment, he suddenly laughed and said in a loud voice, "Little Nye, you really are a sword Dao freak." Sword Dao freak. Shi Lao and Qing Chi couldn't help but stare at Nietion when they heard this. Yin Fenghua, of course, knew what the two of them were thinking and said, "You two can't figure out how Nietion could break my sword formation, right?" "Yes." Shi Lao and Qing Chi nodded at the same time, waiting for Yin Fenghua to explain. Although they saw Nietion break the sword formation with their own eyes, they couldn't figure out how Nietion did it. Yin Fenghua looked at Nietion and said, "Little boy, you're very cunning. With your own sword intent, you can't break the 7-wound sword formation. But your martial physique is very special. It can integrate different sword intents and powers. So you didn't hesitate to hurt yourself and drew the 7-wound sword intent into your body. The intent entered your body, and then you used your own sword intent to integrate the 7-wound sword intent. At the last moment, you burst out a stronger power and broke the sword formation in one fell swoop. Senior is wise. I did take advantage of the situation." Nietion nodded and said with a faint smile. He did use the 7-wound sword intent in the sword formation to break the sword formation. It was indeed a trick. But he also took a great risk by doing so, and he almost lost his life. So that's how it is. Shi Lao and Qing Chi were both smart people. Hearing Yin Fenghua's explanation, they immediately understood. It was no wonder that in the sword formation, Nietion fought the 7-wound sword intent and even led the sword intent into his body. It was to integrate the 7-wound sword intent. It had to be said that this move was too dangerous. A little carelessness would lead to eternal damnation. As Yin Fenghua said, Nietion couldn't break the 7-wound sword formation with his own strength, so he could only take the risk. In terms of sword Dao, Nietion was indeed inferior to Yin Fenghua. However, his martial body and bloodline were powerful, allowing him to break through the sword formation. "Senior, you don't seem to be satisfied with me," Nietion asked carefully as he looked at Yin Fenghua. "Yes." Yin Fenghua nodded and said, "Back then, I set up the 7-wound sword formation to find a swordsman who was on par with me in terms of sword essence. In this case, when he stepped into the realm of one with the sword, you are now qualified to be my opponent. Chapter 4277. Hearing Infengwu's sigh, Nietian couldn't help but frown. It turned out that Infengwu had set up the sword array to find an opponent for him. Unfortunately, Nietian was too weak. He didn't know how long it would take for him to become as strong as Infengwu. With a smile, Nietian asked, "Senior, do you still stand by what you said before?" "Of course, although I am not very satisfied with you. You did break the sword array. From now on, you're my sworn brother. If anyone bullies you in the future, I will stand up for you." Infengwu knew what Nietian was thinking. Infengwu said directly, "Thank you, big brother." Nietian was overjoyed and bowed slightly to Infengwu. "Old Feng, you came out of seclusion this time, and there's another good news." At this time, Elder Shur walked over and chuckled. He looked at Raindrop Thousand Leaf and said, "Why don't you guess who she is?" "Huh?" Infengwu raised his eyebrows and stared at Rui Qinyu for a long time. Suddenly, he thought of something and his expression changed. "Empress of 10 Annihilation." You can tell. This time, it was Elder Shur's turn to be surprised. He didn't expect Infengwu to be able to guess Rui Qinyu's identity directly. This should be the first time Infengwu saw the Empress. How'd he know? Her Majesty is a member of the clan of 10 Annihilation, and her bloodline aura is far stronger than that of the ordinary clan of 10 Annihilation. In addition to your attitude toward the Empress, I would be too stupid if I couldn't tell. Infengwu looked at Elder Shur and said in a deep voice, "Old Feng, are you not happy that the Empress has appeared?" Elder Shur nodded and frowned when he saw that Infengwu didn't seem happy. "Happy? Why should I be happy?" Infengwu sneered with a cold face. "This." Elder Shur's face stiffened. He was stunned for a moment and said, "The Empress is the hope of the Ghost Clan for millions of years. Don't you want her to appear?" "Hee hee." Infengwu chuckled and said, "It's true that the female monarch is the hope of the ghost race, but the appearance of the female monarch will inevitably attract some mysterious forces. I'm afraid the ghost race will never have a peaceful day." "So what?" The Grand Elder's face darkened, and he sternly said, "It's still better than being holed up here." Infengwu shook his head helplessly. Then he looked at Nietian and said, "Nietian, your relationship with the Empress shouldn't be simple, right? You risked your life to challenge the 7 wounding sword formation so that I could come out of seclusion, right?" "Big brother is wise." Nietian smiled faintly. "You've said a lot, brother." Ruiyu's awakening of the 10 Destruction bloodline has not only alarmed the ghost race, but it's also alarmed a great organization lurking in the Saints' world. "Oh." Infengwu frowned and said, "Let me guess, it's the Human Emperor Palace, right?" "Yes." Infengwu guessed correctly, causing Nietian to be stunned. Then he nodded and said, "The people from the Human Emperor Palace have already taken action, and we almost died in the hands of the Pavilion Master of the Heaven Dao, Sacred Pavilion." As he spoke, Nietian briefly recounted what had happened, causing Infengwu to frown. "Old Feng, it's our responsibility to protect the Empress. You won't reject it, right?" The Grand Elder asked worriedly when he saw Infengwu's stern expression. "Fourth brother, how much do you know about the Human Emperor Palace?" Infengwu frowned and asked in a deep voice. "This." The Grand Elder's face stiffened, and he shook his head. His understanding of the Human Emperor Palace was limited to hearsay, and he had no idea what kind of organization it was. The Human Emperor Palace was established when the Saints' World first appeared, and we don't know how long they have ruled the Saints' World. Infengwu frowned and said, "The Human Emperor Palace is mysterious and extremely powerful, but they have very few members. They never have more than 10 people. Other than the Human Emperor, there are usually 6 to 9 elders. The Heaven Dao Pavilion Master should be an elder of the Human Emperor Palace." "Elder?" The Grand Elder's eyes darkened, and he said in shock, "You mean that there are at least 6 other experts like the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master in the Human Emperor Palace?" The Heaven Dao Pavilion Master was an expert who stood at the peak of the Saints' World, and was even known as the #1 person in the Saints' World. Although this title was somewhat exaggerated, it was extremely difficult to find someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Heaven Tao Pavilion Master, at least on the surface. Even so, the Grand Elder was shocked that the Heaven Tao Pavilion Master was only an elder of the Human Emperor Palace. It was hard to imagine how terrifying the Human Emperor behind him was. I speculate that the Heaven Tao Pavilion Master's strength should be the lowest in the Human Emperor Palace. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the Heaven Tao Pavilion Master. In Feng Wua smiled bitterly and shook his head. The Grand Elder was stunned, and his face froze. It was terrifying that the Heaven Tao Pavilion Master was the lowest in the Human Emperor Palace. In Feng Wua let out a long sigh and recalled some past events. He said, back then, the young god was also hunted by the Human Emperor Palace, and he even fought with the Human Emperor at that time, but he lost miserably. That was the only defeat of a young god in his life. The Human Emperor didn't kill him? Nietian couldn't help but ask with a frown. I don't know why the Human Emperor didn't kill the young god. In Feng Wua shook his head. This was also something that he didn't understand back then. Could it be that the young god also joined the Human Emperor Palace? The Grand Elder suddenly thought of something and asked in surprise. I don't know. In Feng Wua shook his head again. He had such a guess before, but he felt that the young god wouldn't want to join the Human Emperor Palace. Human Emperor Elder. At this moment, Nietian suddenly thought of something, and he couldn't help but frown. He had a vague guess in his mind. Yu Tsangxiong was the Human Emperor, and he had once ordered Di Kashu and the Qi Demon God to find the Dragon Shepherds and the Celestial Pole. This meant that Di Kashu and the Qi Demon God were most likely the elders of the Human Emperor Palace back then. Even the first emperor of the Angel Clan might be an elder of the Human Emperor Palace, because he had also received guidance from Yu Tsangxiong. It was hard to imagine that the elders of the Human Emperor Palace were existences at the level of Di Kashu and the Qi Demon God. Then, how terrifying must the Human Emperor be? Nietian, what are you thinking about? In Feng Wua saw Nietian's strange expression, so he raised his head and asked. Nothing. Nietian calmed down and smiled faintly, but he didn't tell the Grand Elder's guess. Fourth brother, with our strength, we can't protect the female emperor. In Feng Wua frowned, then looked at the Grand Elder and sighed. The people of the Human Emperor Palace won't go to the 1,000 layers of ghosts, will they? The Grand Elder's eyes trembled slightly, and he was obviously a little scared. Definitely. In Feng Wua nodded and said, the Human Emperor Palace will never give up on those they want to kill. The female emperor carries the prophecy of destruction, and the Human Emperor Palace will never let it go. Then what should we do? The Grand Elder's eyes narrowed, and his voice was trembling. If the Human Emperor Palace was really as powerful as In Feng Wua said, wouldn't a few elders be able to destroy the entire 1,000 layers of ghosts? Chapter 4278. Meet the Human Sovereign. Everyone frowned, and their expressions changed when they heard In Feng Wua's words. Did In Feng Wua know the Human Sovereign? In Feng Wua glanced at the crowd and said with a faint smile, I met the young Human Sovereign many years ago. After so many years, the young Human Sovereign should be the real Human Sovereign now. The young Human Sovereign? Sure Lao and the others were stunned again. I don't want to say too much about the Human Sovereign Palace. In Feng Wua frowned and looked at Nietian. Nietian, I need a companion to meet the Human Sovereign this time. Are you willing to go with me? Me? Nietian couldn't help but be taken aback. If he was going to meet the Human Emperor, shouldn't In Feng Wua need a powerful companion? For example, the Grand Elder or some other romantic person. Why did he choose a burden? Yes, you. In Feng Wua nodded and looked at Nietian with certainty. Old Feng, are you going to bring him? Shilao seemed to have thought of something, and his expression changed. He was shocked and did not finish his sentence. In Feng Wua nodded and did not explain anything. He smiled and said, Nietian is a good candidate. If this trip is successful, not only will it solve the problem of the Human Sovereign Palace, but it will also greatly improve Nietian's strength. Seeing that the two of them were acting so mysteriously, Nietian's interest was piqued. He asked, Big brother, where are you taking me? In Feng Wua smiled and said, You don't need to know too much now. Just answer me. Are you willing or not? Qing Chi looked at Nie Tian, and his eyes flickered. Obviously, he wanted Nie Tian to agree. It was not easy for Yin Fenghua to think so highly of him. Nie Tian was still too weak and needed to improve quickly. Can I go with you? Rui Qinyu asked before Nie Tian could speak. The corner of Yin Fenghua's lips twitched as he smiled. Your Majesty, I'm afraid you won't be able to go to that place despite your noble status. Rui Qinyu's beautiful eyes darkened, and she did not speak anymore. Nie Tian, the human sovereign palace will not give up. Our trip concerns the safety of the Empress. If we succeed, the human sovereign palace will not dare to step into the thousand-layer ghost region for at least a few hundred years. Yin Fenghua was very shrewd and could tell that Nie Tian was worried about Yu Qin. He said with a smile. Nie Tian's eyes flickered as he nodded. All right, I'll go with you. Yin Fenghua smiled again. He looked directly at Raindrop Qinya and said, Rest assured, Your Majesty, I will definitely bring Nie Tian back safely. Rui Qinyu glanced at Yin Fenghua and stared at Nie Tian for a long time. Finally, she nodded. She knew that Nie Tian and Yin Fenghua were going to the unknown place for her, but she did not want Nie Tian to risk his life for her. That was why she was hesitating. But now that Nie Tian had made up his mind, she could not stop him. Rui, I will be fine. Nie Tian knew that Rui Qinyu was worried and said with a smile. Rui Qinyu nodded and did not speak. Elder Shi, Senior Qing Chi, I will leave Ruoyu in your hands. Nie Tian smiled and bowed to Elder Shi and Qing Chi. Elder Shi smiled and said, Brother Nie, don't worry. With I around, nothing will happen to the Empress even if the human sovereign palace goes to the thousand-layer ghost region. Qing Chi also smiled and nodded. Nie Tian smiled and secretly told Qing Chi to look for Jun Jianxing on his behalf. Ever since Jun Jianxing left, there had been no news of him, which made Nie Tian very worried. Nie Tian had been very busy during this period and could not find Jun Jianxing, so he could only ask Qing Chi for help. Then, Yin Fenghua and Nie Tian left without delay. Rui Qinyu looked at Nie Tian's back with a sad look. She did not want to be under Nie Tian's protection all the time. She wanted to stand side by side with Nie Tian one day and fight against the wind and rain together. After bidding farewell to Rui Qinyu and the others, Yin Fenghua quickly left the thousand-layer ghost region with Nie Tian and entered the ghost-crossing Blood River. 3 days later, Nie Tian and Yin Fenghua entered an underwater tunnel onto the ghost-crossing Blood River. Big brother, what is this place? Nie Tian looked at the tunnel ahead and could not see the end. He could not help but ask. He did not expect such a wide tunnel to be hidden under the ghost-crossing Blood River. This tunnel is called the Yellow Springs Path. It's the entrance to another world. Yin Fenghua was in high spirits and said with a smile, A long time ago, probably before the all-heaven sacred world was separated, the ghost-crossing Blood River was still a complete river. The river winds through the entire all-heaven saints world. It is the birthplace of the Gue clan, and the Gue clan calls it the Mother River. Not long after the ghost race was born, the ghost-crossing Blood River experienced a great calamity. A terrible evil force suddenly appeared in the river, and it was extremely lethal to the people of the ghost race. At that time, the 4 branches of the ghost race suffered heavy casualties and were even in danger of being exterminated. At the most critical moment, someone discovered the Yellow Springs Path under the ghost-crossing Blood River. Then, the surviving ghost race members moved to the Yellow Springs Path and lived here for tens of thousands of years until the evil power disappeared. Therefore, the Yellow Springs Path is the path to save the ghost race. Without it, the ghost race would have disappeared long ago. I see. Nie Tian could not help but exclaim in shock. He did not expect the tiny Yellow Springs Path to have saved the ghost race. The Yellow Springs Path was very big in the past, dozens of times wider than it is now. Yin Fenghua smiled again and said, But at some point in time, the Yellow Springs Path began to slowly shrink. Now, it is only a tenth of its former size. Nie Tian found it strange and asked, Did the ghost race not think of expanding the Yellow Springs Path? Of course they did. Infeng Wua smiled bitterly and said, "But the structure of the underworld path is special and complicated. Every expansion ended in failure. There was even a time when the ghost crossing Blood River was shaken and the entire underworld path was almost destroyed. The entire Yellow Springs path was almost submerged. Since then, the ghost race no longer dared to casually change the Yellow Springs path." Infeng Wua sighed and said, "The Yellow Springs path is getting narrower and narrower. I don't know how many more years it can last." Nye Tian heard the sadness in her voice, and his face immediately became much more serious. The Yellow Springs path used to be the lifeline of the ghost race, but it was getting narrower and narrower. This seemed to be an ominous sign for the ghost race. Although Infeng Wua was a peak swordsman, he was powerless against the shrinking Yellow Springs path. Half a day later, the two finally came to the end of the Yellow Springs path. In front of them was a strange rootless flower floating in the air with dazzling lights, revealing a breathtaking beauty. Chapter 4279. Nye Tian looked at the netherworld flower in front of him and could not help but be stunned for a long time. This strange rootless flower actually made him feel a strong sense of oppression. It seemed that there was an extremely terrifying existence in the flower. Big brother, in this netherworld flower. After a while, Nye Tian looked at Infeng Wua. Before he could finish his words, Infeng Wua raised his hand and interrupted him. Infeng Wua smiled faintly and said, "This flower of the underworld is the flower that guides the way. It is also the gate to another world." "Like a space-time channel?" Nye Tian asked with a frown. "Yes." Infeng Wua nodded, and then his face slightly darkened and said, "Nye Tian, are you ready?" "Ready for what?" Nye Tian was stunned and asked. "Of course, to enter the other world." Infeng Wua laughed, and then suddenly the sword essence in his body suddenly broke out, turned into a continuous stream of sword essence, and crazily poured into the netherworld flower. Nye Tian was stunned by the scene in front of him and could not say a word. In the next moment, he suddenly felt a strand of terrifying energy surge out from the nether spring flower, and it was actually like a shapeless and enormous hand that grabbed him tightly. For a moment, he could not breathe. Then, something even more terrible happened. Before he had time to react, he actually passed out under the pressure of the invisible force. After a long time, Nye Tian finally woke up. He opened his eyes slightly and saw a fat face not far away looking at him with a smile. It was Infeng Wua. Nye Tian immediately stood up and suddenly felt that something was wrong. He looked up at the sky, and the scene in front of him shocked him on the spot and directly petrified him. In the air, dazzling rootless flowers floated around, covering the entire sky like stars falling from the sky. These rootless flowers were the netherworld flower that Nye Tian had seen before. "Nye Tian, this is the new world." When Nye Tian came back to his senses, Infeng Wua laughed and said, "Carefully sense these Yellow Springs flowers and see what you find." Nye Tian frowned. With a thought, he sent his divine sense over. At the same time, he activated his demon eye, pushing his perception to the maximum. He didn't expect there to be so many Yellow Springs flowers here. When he saw how strange the Yellow Springs flower was, he thought that there was only one stalk. He didn't expect it to be so prosperous. After a short moment, Nye Tian suddenly noticed something, and his face changed once more in extreme shock. He couldn't believe his eyes. There was actually a human figure at the heart of each Yellow Spring flower. There was no mistaking it. Each of these Yellow Springs flowers had a human figure on it. "Did you see it clearly?" Infeng Wua noticed Nye Tian's reaction, and he knew what the latter had discovered. However, he wasn't surprised and smiled faintly instead. "Big brother, why are there people in the Yellow Springs flower?" Nye Tian suppressed the shock in his heart and asked in a deep voice. He sensed that these people had a terrifying sword essence. It seemed that they were all swordsmen. To be exact, they are not people but souls. Infeng Wua smiled again and said, "Before these people entered the Yellow Springs flower, they were very powerful swordsmen. But now their flesh and blood have been absorbed by the Yellow Springs flower. Only their souls are left." Nye Tian gasped with astonishment. Don't tell me that the yellow spring flower is a man-eating flower? It was the first time he saw such a terrible man-eating flower that could absorb the flesh and blood of warriors. Hee. Infeng Wua shook his head and said, "The owners of these souls were very powerful swordsmen when they were alive. They all voluntarily entered the yellow springs flower." Voluntarily? Nie Tian was shocked again. Who would voluntarily let their flesh and blood be absorbed? Nie Tian, do you remember the yellow springs flower in the yellow springs path? Infeng Wua smiled again and asked. Yes. Nie Tian nodded. That was the first yellow springs flower he had seen. How could he forget it? That yellow springs flower is actually my sword understanding flower, Infeng Wua said with a faint smile. Flower of sword comprehension? Nie Tian was taken aback. He didn't understand what that meant. The flower of the netherworld can help a swordsman to comprehend the sword Tao. A swordsman entering a flower of the netherworld means that he has chosen that flower of the netherworld as his flower of sword comprehension. Infeng Wua nodded slightly and said, I have entered the yellow spring just like them. I used to understand sword principle in the yellow springs flower. But I was luckier than them. I was not devoured by the yellow springs flower. I see. Nie Tian's pupils shrank, and he was shocked. It turned out that the yellow springs flower could help swordsmen understand sword principle. No wonder these swordsmen were willing to enter the yellow springs flower. The yellow springs flower obviously not only helped swordsmen understand sword principle, but also devoured the power of the swordsman's martial body. The swordsmen in the yellow springs flower wanted to use the yellow springs flower to understand sword principle, but they did not expect to be devoured by the yellow springs flower. These swordsmen's soul bodies were all sword heroes when they were alive. Many of them were even swordsmen who were one step away from becoming one with the sword. They did not care about their lives for sword principle, but they all failed. Infeng Wua could not help but sigh. He was very emotional. Big brother, which era were these swordsmen from? I feel that their soul bodies are about to disappear. Nie Tian became cold and asked Infeng Wua. Many of them are old fellows from millions of years ago. There are even some swordsmen from the ancient era. After their flesh and blood are absorbed by the yellow springs flower, their soul bodies will also be slowly absorbed. In the end, they will completely disappear from this world. I nodded and said, the stronger the swordsman's sword intent when he was alive, the longer his soul body will exist in the yellow springs flower. As he said that, his eyes swept across the yellow springs flower in the sky and sighed, the soul bodies in the yellow springs flower should disappear soon. Sigh. After saying that, he could not help but sigh again. Big brother, what are we doing here? At this moment, Nie Tian suddenly thought of something. His eyes could not help but tremble as he asked, You have already guessed it. Why bother asking me? Infeng Wua squinted his eyes and smiled. His face was so full that his eyes could not be seen. You really want me to enter the yellow springs flower? Nie Tian's face stiffened and he gulped. He had already guessed that Infeng Wua wanted him to enter the yellow springs flower to understand sword principle. However, the risk seemed to be a little too big. What if he was careless and got devoured by the yellow springs flower? Of course. Otherwise, why are we here? Infeng Wua chuckled and said while twirling his beard, However, your mission is very important. It is not as simple as entering the yellow springs flower. What else do you want me to do? Nie Tian was speechless. He wanted to strangle the fat old man in front of him. Chapter 4280. Nie Tian's expression changed when he heard Infeng Wua mention the human sovereign. Was the human sovereign here? Infeng Wua knew what Nie Tian was thinking and said with a faint smile, He hasn't arrived yet, but he should be here soon. Big brother, you seem to be familiar with the human sovereign, Nie Tian said with a nod. Infeng Wua smiled and said, When a human sovereign was young, we were friends. I don't know how many years have passed since then. What kind of person is the human emperor? Nie Tian asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Infeng Wua was silent for a moment. He seemed to recall a lot of things in the past, and said with a sigh. Nie Tian was speechless. The fact that the human sovereign was able to be praised by Infeng Wua showed how formidable the human sovereign was. As for being conceited, it was not strange. Any talented warrior would be conceited to some extent. The human sovereign's talent and strength were at the peak, so it was normal for him to be conceited. Big brother, did you meet the human sovereign here? Nietian asked after thinking for a moment. Yes. Infenghua nodded and suddenly asked, Nietian, do you think it's risky to comprehend swordsmanship in the flower of the netherworld? It should be very risky. Nietian looked at the flower of the netherworld above his head and said, I'm afraid that less than 1 in 100 swordsmen can come out alive after entering the flower of the netherworld. Infenghua looked at Nietian and could not help but laugh. Then his face darkened, and he said, As far as I know, in the past millions of years, about 1 million swordsmen have come to the holy land of the netherworld to comprehend swordsmanship in the flower of the netherworld. But do you know? How many people have come out of the flower of the netherworld? A few thousand? Nietian asked after a moment of pondering upon seeing Infeng and Wu's strange expression. He knew that it was impossible for ordinary swordsmen to come to the land of the netherworld. Only the real geniuses of swordsmanship could enter the flower of the netherworld. Among nearly 1 million geniuses of swordsmanship, there should be a few thousand who succeeded. Infenghua looked at Nietian and shook his head with a smile. A few hundred people? Nietian frowned and asked again. Infenghua shook his head again. Only a few dozen people? Nietian's expression changed. Out of nearly 1 million people, only a few dozen had succeeded. Wasn't this a little too risky? But what he didn't expect was that Infenghua continued to shake his head. This time, Nietian's expression completely changed. He said in horror, It can't be that there are only a few people, right? 3 people. Infenghua nodded and said, Young God Sword Emperor, me, and the human emperor. Nietian's expression changed again. He opened his mouth slightly, as if he wanted to say something, but his tongue didn't seem to listen to him. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't speak. Never in his wildest dreams would he have imagined that out of almost 1 million genius swordsmen, only 3 had succeeded in comprehending the sword. This was not a simple 3 out of 1 million, because these 1 million people were all extremely powerful swordsmen. They were all rare existences among swordsmen. Even so, only 3 people had succeeded in comprehending the sword. From this, it could be seen how dangerous it was to comprehend the sword in the netherworld. Back then, Young God was the first to come to the netherworld holy land, and also the first to succeed in comprehending the sword and become one with the sword. After a while, when Nietian calmed down a little, Infenghua said, I came to the netherworld holy land earlier than Young God. But because of some things in the Ghost Clan, I entered the netherworld flower to comprehend the sword a little later. The human emperor was the last of the 3 of us to comprehend the sword in the netherworld. At that time, he should be about the same age as you are now. He was very young, and his strength wasn't strong at all. But in the end, he was the only one who succeeded in comprehending the sword. Speaking of this, Infenghua seemed to recall the turbulent years of the past. And felt a lot of emotions. Nietian was shocked and didn't react for a long time. After a long time, Nietian looked at Infenghua and asked, Big brother, is it possible to become one with the sword after successfully comprehending the sword in the netherworld? Of course not. Infenghua shook his head and said, Comprehending the sword in the netherworld will greatly improve the sword intent of the swordsman. Once it succeeds, it will prove that the swordsman has the aptitude to become one with the sword. Before Young God comprehended the sword in the netherworld, he was already at the peak of the saint realm. So when he walked out of the netherworld flower, he directly became one with the sword. What about you? Nietian's eyes trembled, and he couldn't help asking. Young God was born with a sword embryo. His innate conditions are not comparable to ordinary people. Infenghua sighed softly and said, Back then, I also entered the netherworld flower in the saint realm of sword martial arts. Unfortunately, after I succeeded in comprehending the sword, I still couldn't become one with the sword. But Huang comprehending the sword in the netherworld has greatly improved me. At least when I fight with Young God, I won't be crushed like before. Speaking of this, there seemed to be unwillingness in his eyes. He had to admit that Yang God Sword Emperor was indeed stronger than him. What about the human emperor? Nie Tian continued to ask. When the human emperor entered the Netherworld Flower, he was only in the god-defying sword sense. But after he succeeded in comprehending the sword, he was already at the peak of Saint Realm of sword martial arts. Yin Feng nodded slightly and said, comprehending the sword in the Netherworld Flower has greatly improved the human emperor. But after leaving Huang, I haven't heard any news about the human emperor since the land of the Netherworld Flower. It's as if he has disappeared from this world. After so many years, I'm afraid that the human emperor has already become one with the sword, Nie Tian said with a gloomy look. Yin Feng nodded and said, I speculate that the current human emperor's understanding of the sword principle is infinitely close to the limit. If he comes back, he will definitely be the best in the sword world. Nie Tian frowned. He could see that Yin Feng seemed to be a little afraid of the human emperor. Big brother, how can we see the human emperor? Nie Tian asked with a gloomy look. Since I brought you to the Netherworld Holy Land, I naturally have to open the Netherworld Flower. When the Netherworld Flower opens, the human emperor will soon come. Come with me. Yin Feng smiled faintly and then moved. He turned into a sword light in the air and flew away. Seeing this, Nie Tian immediately followed. After a while, the two of them came to a hidden valley. In front of them, there was a simple, sword-shaped gate. This is the gate of the Netherworld. With a faint smile, Yin Feng signaled Nie Tian not to step forward. Then, he took a step forward, and the sword intent inside of him burst out. His whole body was like a bottomless abyss of sword intent, and endless sword intent surged madly. Endless sword will surged wildly like a tide toward the gate of the Netherworld. Chapter 4281. Boom, boom, boom. Nie Tian stared at the gate of Yellow Spring and could clearly hear the roar of the sword will. He was shocked. The sword will around Yin Feng's selfless wind surged like the sea. Waves of sword will rolled and roared, constantly attacking the gate of Yellow Spring. Nie Tian felt the terrifying sword will around him and truly witnessed the terror of Yin Feng's selfless wind. It was hard to imagine that this ball-like fat old man actually contained such a terrifying and enormous sword intent within his body. He was like a sea of sword intent, majestic and boundless. In comparison, Nie Tian's sword was like a ditch, almost dried up. Gate of Yellow Spring, open. At this moment, Yin Feng's sword will soar to the extreme. He roared and the huge sword will suddenly erupted, turning into a sword of 7 wounds. It gathered the power of a dragon and rushed towards the gate of Yellow Spring. Buzz! In the next moment, the gate of the Netherworld hummed and opened wide like a giant beast opening its bloody mouth. It's open. Nie Tian's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the gate of Yellow Spring and saw the underworld sea of swords floating in the air, revealing its true appearance. The underworld sea of swords was a sea of sword floating in the air. From its outward appearance, it was like a blunt sword that lay horizontally in midair. Yet if one were to look carefully, one would notice that the sword insight within it surged violently like waves. And even if one was extremely far away, one could still clearly hear the sword howl. Nie Tian took a deep breath and prepared to approach the Yellow Spring Sea of Swords. However, at that very moment, the Yellow Spring Sea of Swords shuddered violently, and then countless streams of sword intent shot into the sky, morphing into countless sword shadows that shot into the heavens. Nie Tian suddenly felt a wave of sword will. His heart trembled, and the wings of Star Soul appeared on his back. With a flap of the wings, he instantly retreated. Although he reacted in time, he was still a little too slow. The endless sword will press down on him, making him feel a tightness in his chest and almost spit out a mouthful of blood. Are you okay? Yin Feng's selfless wind retreated to Nie Tian's side and asked with a faint smile. I'm fine. Nie Tian let out a long sigh of relief and immediately felt the tightness in his chest lessen. You broke through the heavenly sword calamity so easily. You're really lucky, kid. Yin Feng looked at Nie Tian and chuckled. Eh. Nietion couldn't help but furrow his brows. Sensing the sword will, he was taken aback and laughed. He hadn't expected that the pressure from the sword intent would actually allow him to break through to the sword heavenly tribulation realm. If a swordsman wants to comprehend the sword in the Yellow Springs, he must at least reach the sword heavenly tribulation realm. I wanted to help you break through, but I didn't expect you to break through on your own. In Fengwu laughed, but he was surprised. Previously, he had always thought that Nie Tian's talent in the sword Dao was not top-notch, and the reason why he could break the 7-injury sword formation was largely due to his luck. But now, he vaguely felt that he was wrong. Perhaps there was a power in Nie Tian that even he couldn't see through. The pressure from a sword will just now would have seriously injured even a genius in sword Dao. But not only was Nie Tian not injured, but he also broke through. It was incredible. It could be said that breaking the 7-injury sword formation was an accident, and breaking through under the pressure of the sword was also an accident. But if accidents happened frequently, then it could only be inevitable. In Fengwu felt that he had underestimated his sworn brother. Big brother, what does this sword see? Nie Tian calmed down a little. Looking at the countless sword shadows in the sky, he couldn't help but ask. This is the underworld sword sea. Once the gate of the underworld is opened, countless sword shadows will be released. These sword shadows will release a special aura of sword will. Powerful swordsmen or swordsmen with strong sword will can feel it. Then, they can follow the sword will to enter the holy land of the underworld. Guide them to the Yellow Springs holy land. In Fengwu explained with a faint smile. Back then, he came to the holy land of the underworld because he felt the sword will of the underworld sword sea. Nie Tian nodded slightly. It turned out that these sword shadows were like guides, guiding swordsmen to this place. Swordsmen at the level of the human sovereign realm, of course, would feel the sword will of the underworld sword sea, so they would come soon. Then, there will be many swordsmen coming here, right? Nie Tian asked In Fengwu. The sword shadows above the underworld sword sea can last for about half a month. Within half a month, there should be tens of thousands of swordsmen coming here. They will all become your opponents, In Fengwu said with a faint smile. Opponents? Nie Tian frowned and was a little puzzled. In Fengwu smiled again and said, Do you think anyone can enter the flower of the underworld to comprehend swordsmanship? The flower of the underworld in the holy land of the underworld is limited. Swordsmen must compete for the right to comprehend swordsmanship in the underworld. This, Nie Tian's face stiffened, and he was speechless for a moment. So many genius swordsmen actually went through all kinds of hardships to enter the holy land of the underworld to fight for their lives. In his opinion, comprehending swordsmanship in the underworld was indeed no different from courting death. It must be known that over millions of years, only 3 people had succeeded in comprehending swordsmanship. It was too terrifying. Even Nie Tian did not have the confidence to walk out of the flower of the underworld alive. Big brother, why don't we hurry up and search for a flower of the underworld before the other swordsmen arrive? Nie Tian became cold and asked with a frown. In Fengwu said, Do you think you can enter the flower of the underworld at will? The flower of the underworld is a flower of swordsmanship. Under normal circumstances, is always closed. If you want to make the flower of the underworld bloom, you need at least hundreds of swordsmen who are at the level of Sword Marshal Saint's D-Fire to release it at the same time. Only sword wills can make the flower of the underworld sense it. I see. Nie Tian nodded slightly. By the looks of it, the flower of the underworld they entered the holy land of the underworld should have been easily activated because In Fengwu had trained in it. Come, I'll bring you to see the flowers of the underworld that have not been activated yet. You can sense their presence beforehand. It will be very helpful for you when you comprehend swordsmanship in the underworld. In Fengwu smiled faintly, then moved. He disappeared. Nie Tian sensed the presence of In Fengwu's sword intent and immediately followed. Soon, under the guidance of In Fengwu, Nie Tian came to a huge basin and immediately sensed the special presence of the flower of the underworld. He went forward and saw that in the huge basin, there was a sea of flowers of the underworld. However, these flowers of the underworld were not in a state of blooming. The petals had not bloomed, and they were like huge balls of sword intent lying in the basin. Nyetian suppressed the shock in his heart and roughly looked around. There were hundreds of flowers of the underworld in the basin, which meant that there were only hundreds of people who were qualified to comprehend swordsmanship in the underworld. According to Infongwa, there would be tens of thousands of people coming here within half a month. It seemed that the competition was quite fierce. Chapter 4282. Nyetian was shocked. The sword pressure behind him made him feel like he was submerged in a sea of sword essence. He could not breathe at all. The sword pressure was even more terrifying than Infongwu was. Could it be the human sovereign? Nyetian's eyes trembled. He felt like someone had hit his heart. Brother Infong, how have you been? Right at this moment, a clear and powerful voice resounded out amidst the surging sword insight, and it was like the spring breeze and rain that instantly dispersed the powerful sword pressure. Only then did Nyetian feel relieved. He exhaled a mouthful of impure air, and his tense face relaxed. He abruptly turned around and saw a white-robed man standing behind him like a longsword in midair. Is this the human sovereign? Nyetian's heart skipped a beat, and his expression changed. He did not feel a particularly powerful aura from the man in white. However, there was a layer of sword essence flowing around the man's body. It was like flowing water. It looked extremely strange. The man's appearance was not outstanding. At most, he was ordinary. However, he was extremely tall, about 2 meters tall. He looked extremely powerful. Was this man the legendary human sovereign? The one who truly ruled the holy world? Brother Mu, Infongwu smiled. He twitched the corner of his mouth and said, "Maybe I should call you human sovereign." Sure enough, he's the human emperor. Nyetian's heart skipped a beat. However, other than the sword pressure, it seemed that the human sovereign was not as powerful as Nyetian had imagined. It's just a title. Brother Infong, you don't have to worry about it. The human sovereign smiled. His eyes seemed to wander and glanced at Nyetian from time to time. Brother Mu, you must be joking. Infongwu's eyes narrowed. The human sovereign is not a title. He is the one who truly controls the holy world. The human sovereign smiled without saying anything. How should I address you? Suddenly, the human sovereign's eyes became sharp. He stared at Nyetian and asked, Nyetian? Nyetian replied with a smile. Star Saint Lord. The corner of the human emperor's lips twitched as he murmured, Dongwang Zhengrong has a successor. I am happy for him. Nyetian's heart tightened. He didn't expect the other party to be able to see through his identity. Could it be that Ren Huang killed Dongwang Zhengrong? He is my sworn brother. Infongwu smiled and stepped forward to stand in front of Nyetian. At that moment, he sensed a killing intent from the human emperor. Brother Infong, you are underestimating me. The Ren Huang laughed and said, Why would I attack a junior? Fan, are you interested in exchanging a few blows with little brother Nyetian? As he spoke, his figure suddenly flashed and a young man appeared. He looked at Nyetian with a smile, seemingly somewhat excited. Nyetian and Infongwo were both stunned. They hadn't noticed that there was another person behind the human sovereign. Even though Nyetian wasn't strong, he was very perceptive. He could sense that the young man's sword was extremely strange. He didn't seem like an ordinary swordsman. It was unbelievable that a swordsman like Infongwu hadn't noticed the young man's existence. Brother Infong, this is my disciple, the next human sovereign, Lin Fan. The human sovereign smiled and introduced the young man. Young human sovereign. Infongwu's pupil shrank. He didn't expect the young man to be the young human sovereign already. One must know that even Mu Jioga, the current human emperor, was only given the title of young human emperor after his strength reached the heaven realm. This young man named Lin Fan looked to be only 17 or 18 years old. In fact, he must be very young, perhaps even younger than Nyetian. However, he was already known as the young human emperor. This undoubtedly meant that his potential and talent were even higher than Mu Jioga's. Terrifying. Nyetian, do you want to fight with the young human sovereign? Infongwu looked at Nyetian and asked. He was asking, but he was also hinting to Nietion not to accept the challenge easily. Since Lin Fan was known as the young human sovereign, his strength and talent were definitely not comparable to ordinary geniuses. The human sovereign palace had been lurking in the shadows for a long time. It was the force that truly ruled the all-sacred world. Everyone in it had amazing strength. The young human sovereign definitely had unimaginable talent. Sure, Nietion said with a smile and a nod. Of course, he understood Yin Feng Wu's meaning. However, if he was afraid to fight now, he would be too evasive. Most importantly, he also wanted to know how strong this young human sovereign was. Fan go and fight with little brother Nietion. Don't hurt him, the human sovereign said with a faint smile. Although he said it calmly, it was clear that he had determined that Nietion was not Lin Fan's opponent. Yes, master. Lin Fan smiled. His figure moved instantly, and he was as sharp as a sword. Brother Lin, let's fight in 3 swords. How about it? Nietion stood up and said, Sure. Lin Fan smiled indifferently. He opened his palm, and a nearly transparent sword appeared. Suddenly, a sharp sword aura spread out. Like an invisible hand, it sealed the surrounding space. What a terrifying sword will. Nietion felt the fluctuation of sword will in the surrounding space, and his heart couldn't help but tremble. However, in the next moment, the sky sword appeared in his hand. Sword will surged around him, and the celestial demon reverse mark appeared at the corner of his eyes. It was as if a demon had descended. Interesting. Seeing this, Lin Fan couldn't help but laugh. Then, he said, Get ready. I'm going to attack. Nietion nodded slightly. The sky sword was held horizontally in front of his chest, and the sword will soared into the sky. The first sword. The corner of Lin Fan's mouth moved slightly, and the sword in his hand moved instantly. Suddenly, a ray of light shot out and attacked. Nietion frowned. He actually didn't have time to attack, and a sword mark was left on his shoulder. How is this possible? Nietion took a few steps back and stabilized himself. He was extremely shocked. His sword was already considered extremely fast. There had never been anyone who could not even give him a chance to attack. The second sword. At that moment, Lin Fan spoke again. The invisible sword flowed like water, and suddenly, it turned into a stormy sword that pressed down on Nietion. Nietion's heart trembled again. The sword will in his body shot up into the sky, and he wanted to resist the sword will. However, he found that he couldn't resist at all. Boom! In an instant, his sword will was directly crushed, and he couldn't even hold the sword in his hand. His sword will was too terrifying. It was extremely sharp, and it was extremely huge. Nietion had never thought that there would be such a terrifying sword will in this world. What shocked him even more was that Lin Fan's sword realm seemed to be the same as his. It was only the first level of sword disaster. Chapter 4283. In an instant, Nietion felt the killing intent. His spiritual soul trembled, and the blood in his body seemed to stagnate. At this moment, he felt that the void around him was filled with incomparably sharp blades, enveloping him. If he moved even a little, he would die. He did not expect that the young human emperor's sword would be so terrifying. It was almost flawless, and it could erupt with the most fatal killing intent in an instant. Danger! Outside the battle circle, Yin Feng Wu felt that something was wrong, and his expression suddenly changed. But the next moment, he found that he was also locked on by a sword will. Human Emperor Mu Jioga. Yin Feng Wu's pupils suddenly shrank, and his face turned as pale as a sheet. There was no doubt that if he intervened in the battle between Nietion and Lin Fan, Mu Jioga would not stand idly by. In fact, with his status and identity, if he forcibly intervened, it would indeed be unfair. But Lin Fan was too terrifying, and Nietion was no match for him at all. It was a moment of life and death. Nietion's body suddenly shook, and then the sword will in his body suddenly erupted. Suddenly, the sound of demons and gods surged, and the sword will rushed in all directions, as if to break the cage of this part of the world. Bang, bang, bang. In the next moment, the sound of the sword will colliding could be heard. It was as if metal and stone were resonating. The devastating impact spread wildly, and the sword will collapsed one after another. Nietian suffered the strongest impact, where the sword will exploded. Even though his martial body was strong at this moment, he was covered in wounds. On the other hand, Lin Fan was only pushed back slightly, and he was not injured. In the blink of an eye, the sword will dissipated, but the sound of the sword echoed for a long time before completely disappearing. Nietian. Infeng Wua saw Nietian standing there dripping with blood and immediately shouted, "I'm fine," Nietian responded. He was full of energy, and his injury was not too serious. Lin Fan, who was not far away, had a smile on his face. His eyes were filled with excitement as he looked at his prey. "Brother Nya, I offended you just now." Lin Fan smiled faintly and bowed slightly to Nietian, very courteously. Nietian's face was cold and solemn, and he did not speak. Not only had the other party offended him, the third sword had clearly wanted to kill him, but he had blocked it. Indeed, even though the human emperor had instructed him not to hurt Nietian, Lin Fan's third sword was indeed meant to take Nietian's life. However, he didn't expect Nietian to be able to block it. In this world, Nietian was the first swordsman of the same level to be able to block his third sword. The third sword was called the Heaven-Defying Sword. Apart from the terrifying sword intent, the most terrifying thing about it was that it was extremely difficult to break. Not to mention swordsmen of the same level, even those who were a realm higher than Lin Fan, would rarely be able to break through his Heaven-Defying Sword. That was because the Heaven-Defying Sword was Wan Jian's killing move. There was no way to avoid it. If the sword intent was weak, the Heaven-Defying Sword would be almost unbreakable. However, Nietian was very smart and used an extraordinary method to break the Heaven-Defying Sword. Sword Intent Resonance. In an instant, Nietian burned his chi and blood, and with the help of the power of the gods and demons, he raised his sword intent to almost the same level as Lin Fan's sword intent. Then, he triggered the sword intent resonance and used the power of resonance to break the Heaven-Defying Sword. This move was not only extremely dangerous, but also not something that ordinary people could do. To be able to trigger the sword intent resonance, it undoubtedly meant that Nietian had superhuman sword sense, and he had already sensed the vibration frequency of Lin Fan's sword intent. Only in this way could he trigger the sword intent resonance. Although this kid's talent in swordsmanship is not top-notch, his sword sense is superhuman, and his battle talent is unprecedented. Seeing that Nietian was fine, Infeng calmed down, and he was shocked. How could he not see what had happened in that instant? It was a miracle that Nietian could break Lin Fan's third sword. One should know that it was a moment of life and death, but Nietian could think of such a shocking way to break it. This was unparalleled battle talent. The strength of a martial artist not only depended on the talent and strength of the martial body itself, but also on the battle talent. Especially in a battle of life and death, people with super battle talent could often turn the situation around. If it was not Lin Fan who was fighting with Nietian, but a martial artist with ordinary strength who could crush Nietian, he would have been a corpse. Lin Fan's reaction was extremely fast when the sword intent resonance erupted, and he blocked most of the impact with his sword shield in time, so he was not injured. But Infeng Wua could see that the impact Lin Fan suffered was not much less than Nietian, and the sword intent in his body was faintly unstable. Therefore, Nietian suffered external injuries, and Lin Fan suffered internal injuries. After all, Nietian's martial body was not comparable to Lin Fan's. Nietian could take the same impact head-on, but Lin Fan would be instantly killed. Nietian, your performance just now did not disgrace the name of the Star Saint Lord. If Dong Wang Zhengrong knew this in the underworld, he would be pleased. At this moment, Ren Huang opened his mouth and laughed. Senior Ren Huang, are you familiar with Senior Dong Wang? Nietian took a deep breath, and his complexion became better. The wounds on his body gradually disappeared, and he looked at Ren Huang and asked. The human emperor smiled and said, "You should be asking if I killed Dong Wang Zhengrong or not, right?" Nie Tian's eyes froze, and he looked at Ren Huang cold and did not say anything. I did not kill Dong Wang Jingrong, but the order to kill him was given by me. Ren Huang laughed again and said clearly, "If you want to take revenge, I will be waiting for you." His smile was very calm, as if he was talking about something unimportant. It seemed that in Ren Huang's eyes, Dong Wang Jingrong was no different from an ordinary person. "Thank you, Ren Huang, for telling me the truth." Nie Tian was also calm, and he nodded slightly. Ren Huang was a smart man, and he knew that even if he did not say anything, Nie Tian would definitely find out the truth. If that was the case, he might as well be honest. "Brother Yin Feng, your 7 wounding sword formation did not lose in vain." Ren Huang smiled and looked at Yin Feng Wu. "Oh." Yin Feng Wu's lips twitched, and he said, "Brother Mu, you know about the 7 wounding sword formation too? I want to bring Fan Air to try it, but Nie Tian beat me to it." Ren Huang looked at Lin Fan, and he felt that it was a pity. With a calm smile, Yin Feng Wu said in a clear voice, "Then I have to thank Nie Tian. Otherwise, I would have become your nephew." He had just witnessed Lin Fan's strength, and if they were at the same realm, he would not be Lin Fan's opponent. Luckily, Nie Tian took the first step, or else Lin Fan would have become his sworn brother, and he would be 1 generation younger than Ren Huang. No wonder Ren Huang and Lin Fan came to the Yellow Springs sacred ground so quickly, and they were already in the Thousand Layers Ghost Domain. 10 Destruction female Empress had just appeared in the Thousand Layers Ghost Domain, and Ren Huang arrived right after her. It was obviously not a coincidence. Ren Huang came to the Thousand Layers Ghost Domain personally, and it was obvious that he was here for female Empress. Ren Huang personally came to the Thousand Layers Ghost Domain, and this also proved how terrifying 10 Destruction female Empress was. One should know that Dong Wang Jingrong did not even need Ren Huang's help.